When this boy first came to the training ground, he easily sliced a wooden dummy in two. Every one of his movements was incredibly precise and swift, like a finishing blow as he channeled mana. Into his sword, he completely shattered the dummy in just 3 strikes. Lucien thought he had impressed his master with that display, but Sword Saint Eisen just laughed and said his techniques were pathetic. Our boy was stunned. He possessed a body that was one of a kind, the perfect vessel for containing mana. He could push his mana efficiency to its absolute limit and become the strongest swordsman in the world, and yet his teacher of swordsmanship called him pathetic. It turned out our boy had 2 problems. He swung his sword like a common mercenary, and he took too long to channel mana into the blade. Even a body as gifted as his wasn't omnipotent. An experienced mana user would easily crush him in a real fight. Then Eisen showed him what true swordsmanship was and sliced the wooden dummy into dust with a single strike. When he was done, he told Lucien to train relentlessly if he wanted to reach the same level. A few days of training passed, and finally Lucien got the chance to spar with Eisen. He attacked with all his might, but the Sword Saint deflected every blow with just one hand. Lucien tried all sorts of techniques from every angle, but nothing worked. Eisen easily parried them all. Even a powerful overhead strike failed, and Lucien was knocked back. That's when Eisen lunged forward, attacking with a sword shrouded in mana. If Lucien couldn't block this strike, his life was over. So he too channeled mana into his own sword. Their blades clashed in a brilliant explosion of mana. Lucien had successfully countered and even pushed back Eisen's sword. The Sword Saint was utterly shocked. He had never felt such a powerful flow of mana. The progress this kid had made in just a few days was insane. By the time the session ended, the entire training ground was in ruins. It made the servants wonder what kind of training they were even doing. Lucien sat nearby, looking at his trembling hands and his shattered wooden sword. He had only one regret. If only in his past life as a mercenary he'd had this kind of environment and a teacher like this. He wouldn't have died so miserably without a chance to fight back. Mercenary who doesn't die is a second-rate one. At least that's what they always said. Mercenaries are paid a fortune because they're expected to die in their master's place. That was the kind of garbage every mercenary had to hear. In Jack's eyes, all nobles were cut from the same cloth. In desperation, they'd throw open their treasury's promised land and whisper of noble titles. When everything fell apart, they'd turn on you. Suddenly, it was all just excuses, blame, and empty sanctimonious words. Jack had heard enough terrible things from those entitled brats, but nothing compared to what he was being asked to do now. The final order from his noble-born commander was simply put a death sentence. As captain of the Fang Mercenary Corps, Jack couldn't help but laugh. A garbage mercenary like him was expected to die with the honor of a commissioned knight. This so-called final mission, the army had been utterly crushed. The city was in flames, the castle was collapsing, the rebels' blades were at the Crawford family's throat, and there was nowhere left to run. Jack was ready to cut his losses and get the hell out. If even the Empire's most brilliant commander had given up, what was the point in trying? It was a shame that the only decent noble Jack had ever met had to end up in such a pathetic state. The plan was simple. When the rebel army launched their final assault tomorrow, Jack and his men were to fight alongside the commander, holding the line until the Crawford family had escaped. If they failed, Jack was permitted to flee the moment the commander fell in battle. The payment was a gemstone large enough to feed the Fang Mercenary Corps for 3 years. Jack refused. Just because he smiled a lot didn't mean he was a fool. This order turned his brothers into human shields, buying just a few precious seconds for their masters. Everyone knew the rebels wouldn't bother with showing mercy to the Fang mercenaries. The commander insisted otherwise, but it was a blatant lie. To the rebels, Jack and his men were mortal enemies. Throughout the war, they had done too much to earn that hatred. They once disguised themselves as corpses lying in wait among the dead, only to rise up and slit their enemies' throats from behind. Honor meant nothing. Results were all that mattered. Jack had killed countless commanders this way. That was the only reason House Crawford had survived this long. The rebels probably craved Jack's head more than Lord Crawford's. The commander knew this full well. That's why Jack and his brothers were such perfect bait. When Jack refused to obey, the commander threatened to kill him and seize control of the mercenaries by force. Facing the blade of the Empire's most skilled knight, Jack took his stance ready to fight. So this was the state of the Empire's most honorable man. No apology could justify this. Strangely, this suited Jack just fine. It's easier to kill a scumbag than a man of honor. There's no bitter aftertaste. His best option was to offer the commander's head. to the rebels, and then escape. But he knew it wasn't that simple. This man would have already prepared countermeasures. Perhaps the rebels would accept 2 commanders' heads, in exchange for the Fang mercenaries' freedom. Jack was ready to offer up his own life. He had dragged these young men into this war for his own, selfish ambitions. Together they had crawled up from the mud chasing a dream. They had trusted him and followed him through hell, so he had to take responsibility, because he was their captain, and that's what a captain does. Hearing these words, the commander had an awakening about the true meaning of leadership. Shame washed over him. If there was a next life, he would gladly serve a man like Jack instead of the Crawford family. There was no time left. Jack charged forward to attack. The commander didn't move. He begged Jack to never forgive him, then swung his sword to cut him down. The difference in their skill was too vast. Jack's head was severed in an instant. You can't fight against the cruel thing called talent. He hoped this was enough. His men had been ordered to flee if he didn't return. He lived by the sword. It was only fitting that he die by the sword. As his consciousness faded, one question lingered in his mind. If he had been born with the same opportunities as a nobleman, how high could he have climbed? It was nothingness until consciousness returned. Jack awoke, his hearing catching the panicked pleas of a young boy before he could even understand what was happening. A heavy hand slapped at him across the cheek, jolting him fully awake. A young boy stood over him, crying his eyes out and calling him young Master Lucian. He couldn't help but feel that something was very wrong here. First, his scarred, seasoned, and battle-torn body was gone. In its place was the body of a young master, so pristine and fresh it smelled like new grass. Second, who was this little brat who slapped him and was now wailing so pathetically? The boy thought he was dead, and his heart couldn't bear it. As a personal attendant, he would be executed and buried alongside his master. More importantly, it would be a great tragedy for the family. Jack couldn't understand what this guy was rambling on about. Young master attendant family. None of it had anything to do with his life. The last thing he remembered was his own bloody death. How the hell was his head still attached to his neck? His brain started working at full capacity. Assessing the situation and observing his surroundings, he concluded that he had somehow possessed someone else's body. This stranger happened to be a handsome man with a drop-dead gorgeous face. He couldn't help but admire himself in the mirror. His flawless appearance alone radiated a brilliant, noble aura. The decor suggested this room belonged to the child of a ridiculously wealthy family. He needed more information. He searched through the unfamiliar memories, and he remembered his servant's name was Han. To start, he asked Han what year it was. The boy replied that it was the year 1500 of the Augustan imperial calendar, exactly 15 years before Jack's death. He had returned to the past. To avoid suspicion, he told himself not to act surprised by any new information. First, he needed to do what had to be done. With his next question, he asked Han if he wanted to die. Hearing that the boy nearly soiled his pants. How dare a lowly servant touch his master's unconscious body without permission? In a threatening voice, he demanded the boy repeat who he was. Bowing his head, Han apologized for his rude behavior toward young Master Lucian Vandek, the third young master of the great Vandek family. Lucian recognized that noble name immediately. The Vandek family was a pillar that had supported the empire throughout its history, a prestigious and ancient clan positioned as the emperor's right hand. They possessed power that rivaled the imperial family itself. 15 years ago, a young Jack had served as a guard at this very mansion. Instead of returning to his old job, he was reborn as the Archduke's third young master. All his life, he had endured every imaginable humiliation just for money. Because of his low birth, he was now suddenly given a golden opportunity. Perhaps fate wanted him to find the answer to his dying question. If this was the will of the gods, they'd better open their eyes and watch. For the first time, he welcomed the warmth of the sun as Lucian Vandek. He would show those above him just how high he could climb and how he would live. Lucian donned a set of luxurious clothes and stepped out of his room. He had been to all sorts of places during his mercenary days, but no place could compare to the splendor of the Archduke Vandek's mansion. He would need to get used to it. To all this glamour, the sooner the better. He noticed that the servants had been giving him strange looks and whispering amongst themselves. It felt as if he were surrounded by enemies. According to Han, this was only natural. After all, he had always lived a reclusive life. He had locked himself in that room for 1 year and 2 months. It sounded insane that a noble child who could have anything he wanted would withdraw from the world. The minds of the nobility were truly a mystery to him. Pretending to be one of them would be nearly impossible. In this place lived the powerful giant who had once protected the entire empire, Archduke Sigmund Vandeck. That man wasn't the type to stand idly by and watch his son rot in bed for over a year. Either this Lucian was a problem child abandoned by the family, or there were some special circumstances that made the Archduke turn a blind eye. It would be best to avoid his father for a while, but that seemed a bit difficult now. Head butler Edwin had come personally to greet the young master. This man had entered the castle as a hostage from a rival family during his childhood. He was recognized for his outstanding administrative skills, and rose to become Archduke Sigmund's right-hand man. Of all people, this was the one Lucian had to avoid the most. He would surely recognize the behavior of someone from the lowest rung of society. Fortunately, Lucian had been a recluse for over a year. In that case, he could also imitate the noblest person he knew, the man who killed him, the commander, with a warm smile. Lucian thanked Edwin for his concern and said that he had recovered significantly. Furthermore, he had come out to look into the family affairs he had neglected during his absence. The head butler was momentarily stunned by his eloquence. He was relieved to see the young master. His best was unchanged. Thankfully, Lucian's act of playing a nobleman seemed to have worked. He tried to get out of the situation as quickly as possible, but Edwin stopped him from leaving. Right now, the Archduke wanted to see his son immediately. Lucian was brought to his father's study. Archduke Sigmund was an incredibly strict man. At this very moment, he was asking Lucian why he was still alive. Naturally, Lucian was stunned by the blunt question from his supposed father. The Duke had intended to overlook all his ridiculous antics over the past year. He had used his mother's death as an excuse to shirk his duties as a nobleman, acting like a spoiled child. But he had finally crossed a line he shouldn't have. Not satisfied with staging a protest by locking himself away from the public eye, he then tried to harm himself, showing no regard for his own life. Thinking back, Han's frantic and tearful state earlier seemed very genuine. He wanted to assert that there must have been some kind of misunderstanding, but his father was sick of excuses. For the last time, Archduke Sigmund wanted to hear all the thoughts he'd kept hidden in that narrow mind of his, and why he had used his own weak body and limbs to shove sleeping pills into his mouth and cause such a commotion. He had worked in this magnificent residence for a long time, so it was strange that he had absolutely no memory of Lucien. 15 years ago, when he was just a lowly guard, the third young master of the archducal house, Lucien Vandeck, had suffered a tragic, untimely death. The Archduke was famous for having 4 sons, with 4 different mothers. That old man just went around sowing his wild oats everywhere. Jack had worked for this prestigious family for 15 years, and of course had run into the young masters many times, and their mothers. But he had no memory of ever meeting Lucien or his mother face to face. Lady Vandeck died young from a sudden illness, and her son eventually followed in her footsteps for an unknown reason. Back then, the guard Jack had assumed the 2 of them were simply unlucky, sickly, and frail. The real cause of death of Lucius must have been covered up. With his mother's passing, his precarious position in the family, and countless other sad reasons, the burden must have become too much for the young man to bear. In the end, he chose to take a nearly fatal dose of sleeping pills. In reality, he was just trying to get a little attention from his father. It was a cry for help. However, he hadn't anticipated the damage that a year of seclusion had done to his already frail constitution. Unable to fight off the effects of the medicine, Lucius Vandeck had accidentally breathed his last. The new Lucius had to find a way to tactfully navigate this sensitive topic. The Archduke's words sounded a bit cruel for a neglected son he hadn't seen in a year, and the scolding felt a bit excessive. No matter how cold Sigmund appeared, he was still a father. Inwardly, he must have been churning with emotion. But this wasn't the time for Lucius to be concerned with others' feelings. He was on the verge of being cast out of the aristocracy. He might not get another chance to redeem himself if he said the wrong thing. When the Archduke gave an ultimatum, it was best to believe he would follow through. Lucius could almost hear a crack echoing in his promised golden future if he couldn't give the Archduke a satisfactory answer for his actions. At best, he would be sent to a remote monastery to become a monk, and he wasn't ready to bid farewell to the secular world yet. The worst-case scenario was being dragged to the harsh northern territories to endure the bone-chilling cold of the snowfields and become lifelong fodder for starving wild beasts. Only a few hours had passed since his throat was slit, and he'd started a new life, yet his first dilemma had already appeared. Lucius refused to let some troublesome family matters ruin his precious second chance. So he spoke up as his father demanded. First, he sincerely apologized for his own foolishness, which had tarnished the Van Dijk name and troubled everyone, especially his father. He admitted his mistake and promised to obediently accept any punishment the Archduke handed down. But that still wasn't enough to move one of the most powerful men in the Empire. Instead of appealing to his father's paternal love, he advised the Archduke that he should be glad since what was done could not be undone. Instead of tying his life just saved from the brink of death to the past, he intended to live diligently for a bright future ahead. His steadfast stance, determination, and confident demeanor truly added weight to his words. Instead of foolish ramblings, he implored the man before him not as an archduke, but as a father, to grant him a word of encouragement. Lucius believed that a child who does wrong must sincerely repent before their parents, and that parents should be willing to embrace that child with open arms. Wasn't that the obvious principle between a father and child ordained by the laws of heaven? The head butler, Edwin, was utterly stunned by the young master's persuasive words. He sensed a dizzying change in the boy's aura and demeanor. Lucius's behavior and speech were a world away from the weak, timid child who was always cowering in fear. The young man standing before him now seemed like a completely different person. After pondering what his son had just said, Archduke Sigmund didn't like being lectured on his duties as a father. Even so, a smirk flickered across his face. Hearing his son speak made him realize he'd lived long enough to truly see everything in this world. Hearing his father's strict tone soften just a little, Lucius secretly breathed a sigh of relief. Just as he'd predicted, boldly confronting his father head-on rather than cowering in fear was the wise decision. The Archduke valued the spirit of a wild dog that attacks decisively more than a timid mouse that's always probing cautiously. His 15 years of experience dedicated to Sigmund, Van Dijk was paying off right now. The Archduke never expected to hear his most pathetic son speak so brazenly after returning from the dead. Since Lucius himself had mentioned making an effort, Sigmund asked his third son about his plans from now on. Weighing each word carefully, Lucius replied that the first and most important step was to rebuild his ruined body. Then an image of the most talented warrior he had ever fought alongside flashed through his mind. Once his body was healthy again, he intended to learn swordsmanship properly and take it seriously in this life. He figured that if he just ate and slept properly, his vitality would be restored and everything would fall into place. The scowl on the Archduke's face disappeared. He was truly impressed by his son's surprisingly excellent eloquence. Whether everything Lucius said was just empty words, or not, only time would tell. To give him a head start, Archduke Sigmund allowed the head butler Edwin to bring something that might help. Lending a hand to a recluse who just had an awakening would be more practical than offering a few empty words that would have little effect right now. Edwin received the order and calculated that the process wouldn't take long. Lucius was the only one in the room who didn't understand what the two old men were talking about. It didn't take long to realize what his father's help looked like. A series of carriages entered the castle and unloaded heavy packages. Servants carried countless wooden chests and lined them up in front of the mansion. Tucked neatly inside each chest was a massive fortune, from gold coins to precious jewelry. Even when he was a mercenary, Lucius had never seen such abundant resources as this. So this is what it's like to be a high noble. He was provided with a massive allowance without having to do a single thing. This entire treasure trove was just 1 month's spending money, with his pockets overflowing. Perhaps it was worth investing in something revolutionary, something that could recreate his frail body. He envisioned himself showing off his strength and overwhelming everyone in the Empire. All he needed to do was create an extremely special elixir. After meeting and talking with his third son, Archduke Sigmund suddenly wanted to take a stroll around his pristine garden. Edwin followed right behind as the Archduke was lost in thought. According to the head butler, this was the place the late Archduchess Lucienne's mother had cherished before she passed away. It had been a long time since the Duke had visited this nostalgic place. It was all too clear why he chose today to change that. Young Master Lucienne's sudden change must have reminded Sigmund of the old days. Despite the boy's past behavior, the Duke had always held a soft spot in his heart for him. After all, he was still the son of the Archduchess, whom the Archduke had loved so dearly. Stepping into the middle of the beautiful garden, Sigmund quietly recalled the pathetic appearance of his son from before. The boy's eyes were always darting around shiftily, as if he were afraid of everything around him. If Sigmund raised his voice even slightly, he would whimper like a beaten dog. Lucienne had become so very different from the late Duchess. Sigmund had all but given up on the boy. He used to think that the only thing Lucian inherited from his mother was his appearance. But Sigmund's opinion of the boy changed for the first time today. The thought that he might have been wrong flashed through his mind after that meeting. Edwin must have also seen that spectacular change. Instead of cowering, the boy had looked his father straight in the eye and bravely spoke his mind. He didn't flinch before the pressure and showed an incredibly resolute spirit. From the beginning, they knew Lucien had a soft heart. Perhaps he was just a late bloomer compared to his brothers. After all, he also carried the Archduke's blood. Even so, Sigmund remained cautious, not wanting to get his hopes up too high. From now on, he would give Lucien challenges that couldn't be solved with mere rhetoric. On that note, Edwin mentioned a potential problem that could arise. They had reinstated Lucien's allowance, and news of this had leaked. Through his investigation, Edwin discovered that the second young master, Jordi Van Dek, was involved in this matter. Furthermore, Jordi had already begun to act. He fired Lucien's headmaid and placed one of his own confidants in that position. It was a clear display of his intention to control his younger brother. Sigmund understood that his second son always held a grudge against the youngest over matters related to their mother, but this obsession was truly concerning. Edwin suggested intervening, but the Archduke stopped him. Though he knew it might be too harsh for someone just taking his first steps, the malicious actions of Jordi were merely petty games and would be ineffective if Lucien learned how to manage his subordinates. Consider this the price his third son must pay for not coming to his senses sooner. For now, Sigmund wanted to see how his son would handle this problem. If Lucien failed, he would have to bear the consequences himself. The blood of the Van Dek family is the key, but one must always use their own strength to open that door. That is the nature of a lion. A few days later, Lucien locked himself in his room again, with Hans standing guard outside the door, raising worried chatter among the servants. 3 days had passed since the suspended allowance had been reinstated. When the stacked chests were delivered, Han couldn't believe his eyes. The young master believed the massive influx of gold was thanks to his smooth conversation with the Archduke. Considering their fractured father-son relationship, Han could see that it couldn't have been easy at all. The loyal servant couldn't be prouder to see his master moving forward instead of wallowing in misery. However, Han had no idea that Lucien's mind was reeling with the possibilities this enormous fortune could unlock. With such abundant resources, he could have gathered enough ingredients to completely transform this sickly body. An ideal physique would be within his grasp if he could successfully concoct that elixir. It took him a mere 3 days to burn through the entire allowance, turning his room into a grimy apothecary. He had worked tirelessly to perfect his method. Han must have been very curious, but the fact that he stood guard outside the door without questioning the order was a testament to his loyalty. On Lucien's desk were concoction tools that the son of an archduke would never touch in his entire life. Surrounding him were crates of unbelievably expensive herbs, the kind that only grows under the moonlight at this time of year. The common uses for that rare moonlight herb hadn't even been discovered yet. Lucien had squandered his entire monthly allowance to buy as much of it as possible. In everyone's eyes, Lucien looked like nothing more than a madman right now, but in 1 year this decision would yield enormous profits. The price of the moonlight herb would skyrocket 10 times, no more, like 20 times. He was basically hoarding a flower-shaped version of Bitcoin in the year 2010. Now, as he personally extracted the value from this miraculous herb, he grew to admire the audacity of the Alchemists Guild even more for when they began experimenting with the moonlight herb. Success was surely far from certain, but they still took the gamble and gathered all the moonlight herbs in the empire. They made the bet of a lifetime with the very fate of their guild. Thanks to that audacity, the alchemists would release an unprecedented miracle drug that would shake the entire empire. People called that wondrous medicine Nita, the drink of the gods. For the arrogance of labeling an earthly medicine with a divine name, the Alchemists Guild faced the risk of being accused of blasphemy by the church. But once the effects of Nita became known to the public, everyone was so busy trying to get their hands on it that the accusations of blasphemy were forgotten. After 3 days of toiling with his alchemy kit, Lucien finally succeeded in creating a batch of Nita. It challenged a truth that had been undisputed for over 1,000 years. The limits a martial artist could reach were supposed to be determined at the moment of their birth. For a very long time, that limit was considered an absolute unbreakable law. One's innate self was predetermined, and a person's physical constitution could never be changed. Those long-established certainties were quickly shattered to pieces thanks to Nita. Just by drinking one vial, it could turn someone with no talent at all into a true warrior. The things he had hastily concocted. The concoction made in this room can't compare to the utility of the original. After all, you're not a true alchemist, you only know how to create the mass-produced version. But this is more than enough to restore your currently severely weakened body. You were truly lucky to have turned back time to make this a reality. Later, when the era of chaos erupted across the Empire, the first thing to be burned to the ground was the Alchemists' Guild. The authorities considered the Nita formula a destabilizing force that threatened the balance of power. Those on the throne did everything in their power to erase the original formula from history. However, some people managed to gather enough clues to piece together something similar. One of them was the mercenary Z, most of those who tried to experiment with the moonlight. Herb perished from the side effects, but you succeeded. Without hesitation, Lucien opened the freshly brewed vial of Nita and drank it all. By doing so, he became the first human to make the power of nature his own. Depending on how smoothly the circulation process goes, he could harness the mana flowing through his body to evolve. The quality and power that each person can unleash are completely different. Borrowing the wondrous power of Nita, he began to force open the clogged mana pathways within his body. Lucien thought the medicine's effect would stop once his pathways were cleared, but he was mistaken. Normally, one would have to endure excruciating bone-deep pain from this intense process, but he felt completely normal. On the contrary, an abundant amount of mana was spreading unhindered throughout his body, seemingly searching for and settling into its rightful place. Even the body of a newborn infant usually contains impurities that hinder circulation at some point. Could it be that Lucius Van Dex was originally in the realm of natural-born geniuses? As the sun began to set, the sound of Han's anxious pacing echoed outside Lucien's room. Finally, the door that had been locked for days creaked open. The young master finally stepped out of his seclusion and asked Han what had happened while he had the door locked. As usual, the weepy servant ran to his master with a worried expression. Han had been calling for the young master repeatedly but received no reply. All he could do was stand guard outside the door day and night. He was terrified that something had happened or that Lucien had gone back to being a recluse. But the truth was the complete opposite. The young master's eyes had become sharper than ever. As the person who understood him best, Han could tell that something had definitely changed. Lucien gave off a feeling and looked just like a completely different person. From the outside, there were no major changes yet beneath the splendid clothes. He was still just a scrawny skin-and-bones kid. It would still take more time and a proper diet to improve that. What was truly important was the change from within. His heart was now pumping with the purest mana. From deep within, he was undergoing changes at a dizzying speed. Lucien's innate physique had made this result possible. Feeling the unhindered effects of the Neta, he was certain that this body's potential put him on par with the legendary figures who had once changed the world. If things went smoothly, he could even surpass his peak as a mercenary captain in less than a year. Since Han had helped him so much over the past few days, in a way he felt indebted to the boy. He believed that rewards and punishments must always be clear. Grabbing the boy's shoulders, he urged Han to listen carefully. He advised Han to scrape together every last coin of his savings and pour it all into an extremely lucrative investment right from the early stages. Just do that, and Lucien promised to give the poor servant the easiest money he would ever make. Feeling like a benevolent saint, Lucien promised to pull Han along with him when this investment skyrockets. He was completely serious and in his era. No noble would ever care for a servant like this. A week after drinking that magical potion, Lucien was in the mood for a walk around the quiet nearby forest. He whistled and hummed throughout the stroll while Han looked at his young master as if he had gone mad. Lucien was just enjoying a lifestyle as wonderful as heaven. He had never thought life could be this comfortable. At the Duke's residence, lavish meals would appear whenever he wanted. He could enjoy feasts like a king. His room would be cleaned and kept spotless without him having to lift a finger. The maids would even prepare his bed for him without being told. When he was a lowly mercenary, going hungry was a part of his daily routine. Thanks to the comforts of the nobility, he was able to fully concentrate on his body's recovery. He had also resolved an issue that had been bothering him for the past week. He had investigated the existence of Jack, the man who was supposed to have been hired as a guard for the Van Deck house in this timeline. After checking with the current captain of the guard, he found out that no one even resembling the man named Jack had ever applied for the 10-hour shift that he used to work. It was now covered by another guy he had never met. For now, this was for the best. There was no benefit in running into his past self. It might even distract him. Besides, he didn't have the courage to face his former self. He'd probably die of shame on the spot. As they neared their destination deep in the quiet forest, Han expressed his concern about continuing forward. The old Lucius absolutely detested setting foot in the training grounds, but the current him didn't mind at all. Han reminded his master that ever since Lucius was scolded by the two young masters, the last time he had sworn never to return to that awful place. Looking at Han's reaction, it was easy enough to imagine what had happened back then. For a noble son of the Archduke's family, sword training was a basic requirement. His brother Geordie must have used the pretense of sword training. To use the training ground as the perfect stage to crush him, he had planted absolute terror in young Lucian's mind, ensuring that a rival for the inheritance would never again set foot in the training grounds. It was easy to guess why. Geordie would do such a cruel thing, but there's no need to dwell on that now. What happened in the past should be left in the past. It's time to cast that fear aside. Han just needs a little faith, and to follow his master closely. Inside the training grounds, the knights of House Vandex stirred at the news that the third young master had personally come to their sacred ground. A mustached knight seemed particularly displeased. Seeing that Vandex brat dare to set foot in the training grounds, he saw this as an opportunity to remind the kid of what happened the last time he was here. First, he sent someone to report the third young master's arrival to the training grounds manager. The mustached man would ensure a lavish meal was prepared before his boss arrived. The moment he stepped into the facility, Lucian saw a place that far exceeded anything he had ever dreamed of. There were plenty of spare weapons neatly arranged on racks, so there was no need to worry about damaging a weapon during practice. The space and the spectator stands were incredibly spacious, perfect for high-intensity training. It was absurd to think that all of this was just one person's private training facility. If he and his brothers had the chance to train in a place like this, perhaps a few of them would have lived a little longer. His reminiscence was cut short by the grating voice of the mustached knight who was stroking his facial hair. He expressed his sarcastic surprise at seeing the third young master. The mustached man didn't forget to remind Lucian how the second young master, Geordie, had disciplined the third young master in front of everyone last time. He compared the incident to a lamb being chased by a wolf. The mustached knight smirked and subtly mocked Lucian for daring to bring a servant into the sacred land of warriors. His name was Hendrik, and even his introduction was filled with undisguised ridicule for Lucian. A year ago, Hendrik had personally led Lucian's swordsmanship lesson, along with the second young master. He found the experience very amusing, but the Lucian of the past did not. Besides his brother, this Hendrik fellow also played a part in instilling an absolute fear of swordsmanship in the third young master. The current Lucian was completely different, compared to his past self. Having this mustached bastard show off in front of everyone, things were starting to get interesting. Traditionally, knights are praised as the embodiment of honor and loyalty. They are often born into noble families, receiving rigorous training in martial arts and etiquette from a young age. Once they achieve sufficient merit through battles and missions, they can be officially knighted by their lord, elevating their status to that of a true knight. From Lucian's perspective, knights were nothing more than expensive hunting dogs wearing their master's flashy collars. They were obligated to be polite and sycophantic towards the lords and high nobility, those who could grant them wealth and fame. And this arrogant bastard in front of him, Hendrik, couldn't even get that right. Lucian's low standings in the family was probably part of the reason for his poor treatment. But the main reason this man had the guts to be such an asshole was because he had someone backing him up. Geordie's leash gave him the delusion that he was untouchable. Honestly, Lucian really wanted to give this clueless idiot a proper training course, to shatter his mindset from the very root and much more. He would have gladly toyed with this man if he had the chance. Unfortunately, he had to remember how his father would react if he went too far. Whether he liked it or not, knights were still the core fighting force of a noble family. They were valuable assets. Any punishment deemed inappropriate would only create tension, unnecessary tension between a lord and his vassals. Lucian couldn't go all out just yet. Now was not the right time. In a clear, firm voice, he spoke up. He couldn't just avoid the training grounds because of a minor incident in the past. He declared that from now on, he would be stopping by here more often to learn the sword forms. He had wasted too much time rotting away. He had a lot to catch up on. Hearing the third young master mention learning sword forms, Hendrik burst into a booming laugh. He asserted that at Lucian's age it was far too late to start learning sword forms. He explained that once you're past 15, starting from scratch is impossible. For a 16-year-old who's only ever shut himself in his room, all hope was lost. Sword forms are secret arts and legacies left by those who came before, simply by practicing the techniques created by their ancestors. The new generation can attain enlightenment of their profound philosophies. They can also temper their bodies, a perfect testament to ancient wisdom at its peak. But inherently, sword forms are only for those who have opened their mana circuits. According to Hendrik, those mana circuits close after the age of 16. If Lucian started learning now, it would be no different from regular exercise. Learning sword forms without attaining enlightenment is like an empty shell, completely useless. Perhaps that's more fitting for the third young master. Useless training for a useless noble. While he was at it, he could even become the greatest dancer in the Empire. That way he'd save time figuring out what he was actually good at, instead of just mindlessly swinging a sword. Hendrik even suggested that Lucian would be better off spending his days tending to the gardens. After all, in this world, everyone has their own role to play. Judging by the silence of the other knights, it seemed they all supported Hendrik's mockery. The mustached knight was quite pleased with himself for having put a noble brat in his place, rendering him speechless and unable to utter a word. In truth, the idea that mana circuits close at 16 was a blatant lie. It was something that could be easily exposed, with just a little bit of testing. But that didn't matter to Hendrik. If he got called out, he could just play dumb and smoothly brush it off. His real goal had been achieved. He just wanted to completely crush the hope of a foolish kid who couldn't even talk back. All the knights at the training ground saw Lucian as a pathetic, frightened bug frozen in place, even as he was being mocked by a familiar subordinate of the third young master. Piling on, he replied in a weak, trembling voice that Hendrik's point of view sounded a bit different from the books. As far as he knew, the mana circuit doesn't close at the age of 16, but at 25. There would be no problem if he started right now. Henry supported his claim, insisting he was the one who was right. Lucien immediately seized the opportunity and dragged his older brother, Geordie, into the conversation by asking if Henry's boss shared the same opinion on the matter. The fool Hendrik confidently replied that his boss would back him up. He didn't even know that he had just fallen into a trap that had been laid out with such sophistication. Lucien lamented that the house of Van Dex must be on the decline these days. He even dragged the bewildered Han into his performance. The young master complained that the foolish knight in front of him couldn't even grasp the most basic thing that even a stray dog on the street would know. How many promising talents have been robbed of their opportunity because of this ignorance? If his family's knights can't even cram a basic fact into their tiny brains, then the next generation of knights is doomed. Thanks to Hendrik's big mouth, Lucien could pin all the blame on his dear brother's empty skull. If Geordie ran his training ground with such ignorance, then this was a disgrace to the family and a clear crisis. Surely a mere subordinate like Hendrik would never dare to deliberately deceive the Lord's own son. After hearing Lucien's sharp scolding, the mustached man staggered slightly. Being accused of deceiving the Archduke's son was an extremely serious matter. There's no way a knight of the House of Van Deck would do something so despicable, right? Fearing a slip of the tongue, Hendrik stubbornly held to his previous position. Lucien intended to get to the bottom of this. He couldn't just turn a blind eye to this level of deficiency. It was time to show this arrogant knight the consequences of his reckless words. Sir Hendrik seemed completely unaware of the gravity of the situation. If he had merely wanted to humiliate Lucien, this merciful young master would have graciously let it slide. He was willing to accept the fact that Hendrik and everyone else here looked at him with hostility due to his own fault of forgetting his noble duties and wasting time. He would never blame his people for holding him accountable. But beyond that, if the knights and his brother, the pillars of the Archduchy, were hindering the recruitment of talent with false knowledge, Lucien would not sit back and turn a blind eye. Ignorance would fracture the military strength of the prestigious Van Deck's knightly order. To be precise, it could bring untold danger to their people. With just a few words, Lucien had turned the tables, transforming the mockery into a proud speech. As a proud bearer of the Van Deck name, his outrage at such misconduct was entirely justified. His argument was incredibly sharp, making the fool Hendrik understand the weight of his every word. He had better prepare himself for the consequences of this encounter. Lucien threatened to report this matter to his father and request an internal purge targeting Geordie's subordinates. Hendrik couldn't believe what was happening. The brat who used to tremble at the slightest taunt was now fighting back. Just a year ago, Lucien was as fragile as a lamb. Now he was like a hungry wolf, an apex predator that could crush the little Henry without a moment's hesitation. Seeing the chaos, the master of the training ground was forced to intervene. Geordie Van Deck, the second young master of the Archduke, finally showed his face. Henry was so scared he nearly pissed his pants, while Lucien was secretly glad that his older brother had appeared at just the right moment. Jody looked at his younger brother with a disgusted expression. In a panic, Hendrik rushed over to his master to explain what was happening. He stammered, trying to force out an explanation to absolve himself of all blame. Fed up with his fearful stuttering, Jody told him to shut his mouth. There was no need for an explanation. Jordy had been watching from a distance the whole time. He had seen and heard Hendrik's disgraceful attitude with his own eyes. As a knight, he should be ashamed of himself for being rattled by a child half his age. Jordy, completely disappointed, squeezed the knight's shoulder forcefully. Jody ordered him to fix that ugly look on his face, unless he wanted to put his master in an even more difficult position. Han cowered behind Lucien as Jordy walked towards them. The spineless servant trembled while the third young master looked his older brother straight in the eye without blinking. "Long time no see, Jordy," Lucien taunted. The face of his older brother, Jordy Van Dek, was revered by many as a noble among nobles. Ever since Lucien's previous life, the guy was known for having a garbage personality, because his influence was far inferior to that of the Archduke's eldest son, Jordy. Had to resort to recruiting outsiders to his faction. Most of them met tragic ends. Once Jordy considered a tool to be useless, he had a habit of blaming them or casting them aside without a second thought. For now, Lucien offered his brother a polite smile and a proper greeting. It had been a long time since they had spoken, so he offered some common platitudes. Without beating around the bush, Jordy bluntly called Lucien a foolish creature. He declared that he had been watching everything that happened ever since his younger brother set foot on his training ground. Jordy accused him of behaving in a way that sullied the honor of their esteemed family. Lucien maintained his calm demeanor and asked his brother to elaborate on his accusation. Jordy made the excuse that it had been a long time since Sir Hendrik had studied theory, so the earlier argument was just a misunderstanding. Even so, using his noble title to cause unnecessary disturbances was clearly a mistake. For that, Hendrik could not evade responsibility. However, Jordy had no intention of reprimanding or punishing his subordinate for such a minor incident, because unlike his useless little brother, he claimed to understand the weight of loyalty and knew how much blood and sweat Sir Hendrik had shed for the family. Furthermore, what right does someone who ran away because he couldn't endure the most basic swordsmanship training have to criticize and blame a true knight? Jody stressed that Lucien, first you must learn to respect your own vassals before making any accusations. It is thanks to our dedicated knights that the Van Dekst family can survive and rule. Jordy turned to his men and sincerely apologized on his brother's behalf. He treated today's commotion as nothing more than the outburst of an immature child who needed to be shown tolerance and promised to take special care of this foolish younger brother. Lucien was quite impressed with how Jordy handled his verbal attack. The guy's mind was sharp. Lucien had aimed his insults and accusations directly at Jordy, but the second young master cleverly twisted them into an insult against the knights, riling them up while managing to save his own face. Today was just a warm-up. He'd give Jordy credit for handling the immediate problem smoothly. Placing a hand on his chest, Lucien acknowledged the misunderstanding and expressed his gratitude for Jordy's decision not to reprimand him. He acted as if he were engraving Jordy's words into his heart, treating them as precious teachings even while praising his brother. Lucien still found a way to subtly call him an empty-headed fool. He expressed shame for his earlier disgraceful words, portraying himself as a younger brother who was always eager to learn from his older brother's generosity. Lucien flattered Jordy excessively, ordering Han to immediately transcribe his brother's golden words. Ordinary paper wouldn't be worthy. Those words had to be embroidered on the finest silk. This served two purposes. He was using Jordy to erase his own weak image while simultaneously engraving a new solid impression into everyone's minds. This was a metamorphosis. The pathetic third young master no longer existed. In his place was a man who knew how to play the games of the nobility. With that, Lucien apologized and asked Jordy for permission to leave. After all, nothing good would come of them continuing to argue in front of their subordinates. Jordy didn't lose, but he couldn't help but feel his blood boil at Lucien's razor-sharp provocations. He wanted to keep the brat here in his domain a little longer, to teach him a crueler lesson. But Lucien had cleverly reminded him that their father was watching him very closely these days. Starting from zero, he had nothing to lose, but his older brother wasn't in the same position. He turned his back, taking Jordy's silence as an agreement. Lucien grabbed Han, and they dashed out of the training grounds without any hindrance. He'd had a bit of fun teasing Geordie, so now they would just leave. The moment Lucian stepped away, Hendrik tried to urge his master Geordie not to let him leave so easily. That was the most foolish thing he could have done right now. Geordie was seething with rage. He knew full well that he had just been thoroughly played. Lucian and Han took the scenic path they had walked earlier. The attendant felt extremely uneasy knowing they had just offended the second young master. Lucian knew better than anyone what kind of tricks the second young master Geordie was capable of. Han was terrified of that monster's retribution. Even if they were lucky enough to escape this time, there was no guarantee they'd be safe next time. Han looked like a helpless animal terrified of being hunted. Lucian understood why Han was acting this way. The boy was experiencing a feeling that only those who have served the nobility can truly understand. When a useless superior makes a mess and then shirks all responsibility, it's often the powerless ones who are left to suffer the consequences. There is nothing more infuriating than a master who doesn't care if their subordinates live or die. Lucian knew that feeling all too well, and he wouldn't let little Han go through what he had once endured. He reassured his servant that some pompous knight would never be able to touch them. He simply wouldn't let it happen. Over the past few insane days, Han had suffered a great deal. Lucian was grateful for everything the boy had done. When a master acts like a fool, it's always the subordinates who get crushed. As the attendant to an eccentric young master, Han must have endured a lot. To soothe the boy's fears, Lucian made him a promise. From this day forward, he would not let his people be looked down upon anymore. They would never have to live in fear regardless of their master's seemingly foolish actions. Han etched the young master's promise into his heart and took his supportive hand. Back at the Van Dext estate, Lucian was strolling with his trusted attendant. After the incident at the training grounds, he felt it was strange. Everything had suddenly become eerily quiet. He knew very well that Geordie wasn't the type to take a hit without fighting back. Today, Lucian had discovered the low-life trick, that his brother was secretly plotting. He received a piece of paper that made him angrier than ever before. Strangely, even the ever-obedient Han couldn't turn a blind eye to the contents of that paper. The master and servant stormed off as if they had just suffered the worst injustice in the world. That brother of his had dared to touch something he should never have touched. Lucian's allowance. Han tagged along in outrage because even his own salary had been cut. That morning, Lucian had woken up early in a very cheerful mood. He knew the letter detailing this month's budget plan was about to arrive. Today was the day he planned to buy more moonlight herbs and stock up on necessary supplies. His account should have been refilled after his massive spending spree last month. At least that's how it should have been. But when he saw the number on that paper, his smile vanished. He was so shocked that he dropped the document from his hand. According to the budget summary, his allowance had been cut by 75%. Similarly, Han's salary was also reduced by 30%. That bastard Geordie dared to play games with the numbers through the head maid he had planted in Lucian's villa. It was unforgivable. They dared to do this even though they knew full well that embezzlement was a capital offense punishable by death even among the nobility. Lucian admitted that he was partly to blame. The only reason his brother could get away with such a ridiculous scam was because of a lapse in his own defenses. After the third lady passed away, Lucian had entrusted the budget management to someone else, Dana. The former head maid, who had been with the family for a long time, had always managed the budget masterfully and with dedication. Not long ago, Dana was replaced by the young head maid, who was now managing Lucian's wing. Today was the first time he had come face to face with this new head maid model. With a smile on her face, she politely greeted her master in name only. She introduced herself as Jenny, claiming she had wanted to greet the lord of the house as soon as she was appointed. But back then, Lucian seemed to have no intention of leaving his confinement. It was a relief that the long period of rotting in bed had finally come to an end. He couldn't stand her tone when she spoke to the young master. Lucian admitted that Jenny hadn't said anything out of line, but today he wanted to skip all the pleasantries and small talk. He had come to the maid's quarters personally to discuss more pressing matters. To settle the financial issue once and for all, he decided to ask Jenny directly. He asked if she was the one who had drawn up this month's ridiculous budget plan. In response, she merely suppressed a chuckle. Jenny proudly admitted that she had written the entire thing herself. She made the excuse that Lucian had given full authority to the previous head maid. When taking over Dana's responsibilities, she was simply carrying out her assigned duties. The cunning Jenny declared that she felt a bit confused by the young master's questioning, especially when she had been working so incredibly hard all this time. After all, setting the budget was a task the master of the house was supposed to handle himself. Lucian knew full well Jenny would use that fact as an excuse. Once again, his own indifference was partly to blame for that. He had to admit there was nothing he could do about it. However, something still didn't add up. According to the budget, most of the money his father provided had somehow been allocated to raising the salaries of the entire staff. In any case, the servants had suffered because of his irresponsibility, so he was willing to consider the amount of this loss as compensation. But if that was the case, why was Han's salary cut instead of increased? Even a child could see this was a blatant financial attack orchestrated by this young head maid. Jenny played dumb, insisting there must have been some mistake. She used the hardship of managing the household as an excuse for this oversight. She pressured the maids under her to act as witnesses to confirm just how overworked she had been. Seeing how the servants froze under her gaze, it was clear Jenny had completely taken over this wing through her staff. With panicked smiles all, the maids hurriedly spoke up to defend Jenny's decision while endlessly praising her. They even promised to better support the head maid from now on to prevent such oversights. Lucian sighed in defeat and retreated with Han. For a rare moment, Han had expected his master to fight back, but he didn't, not this time. The body of this estate might bear Lucian's name, but its limbs were serving another. Before leaving the maid's quarters, Lucian threw Jenny one last question. He hoped she would answer it carefully. He directly asked her who her real master was. In response, Jenny insisted on getting her master's opinion first. Her master, Geordie. From Lucian's perspective, the necrotic flesh had to be cut away for the body to survive, and right now, his heart was rotting from the inside. The cure for that rot could likely be found in a tavern on the shady streets of the Van Dek territory. Dressed in a dark cloak, the third young master dragged Han into a suspicious establishment under the guise of going fishing to clear his mind. But instead of calm waters, they stepped into a gambling den, an underground fighting pit packed with degenerate gamblers. In the middle of the tavern was a fighting ring where gladiators fought viciously for the customers' entertainment. If you were to ask Lucian, this was the perfect place to cast a line. And who knew? Maybe today they'd catch a big one. Bypassing the central area, he headed straight for the deserted bar counter. The bartender saw him from a distance and immediately shouted. He warned that this place wasn't for nosy brats. Lucian complained that a gambling den shouldn't be so picky about its customers. What if that customer happened to have plenty of money to blow on bets? The moment he showed his face, the bartender's attitude did a complete 180. There were a few reasons why Lucian didn't just drag the head maid out and flog her in front of the entire staff. First, Jenny wasn't just a mere employee. Her backing was formidable. She was the daughter of the wet nurse who had practically raised Geordie since he was in her arms. He had always treated her like a little sister. Touching that woman thoughtlessly would only ignite an even worse problem. Second, the hierarchy within Lucian's estate had become a bigger mess than he had ever imagined. His current difficult situation was far beyond ordinary and required a special remedy. Finally, his father, the Duke, was still watching his every move. There was no way. That man wasn't aware of this budget interference. In other words, cleaning up this family mess was just another test he was forced to pass. He just needed to show the Archduke and the servants his true ace in the hole. To make things go smoothly, he decided to take what little pocket money he had left and dive into the gambling tables in this dark den. Slowly but surely, his pile of chips grew higher thanks to perfectly played hands. The sound of the dealer's skillful shuffling echoed through the hall. It was also the sound of money flooding. Money flowed into Lucien's pockets. It had been several hours since he sat down, focused intensely, and started lining his wallet. He had won so many games in a row. His table had attracted a crowd of spectators. He had just cleaned out one of the gambling world's most seasoned players without breaking a sweat. As a regular in the gambling scene, he knew. Old Soldier couldn't believe he'd been completely cleaned out by some brat. Lucian had thrown plenty of sharp taunts across the table, making him a particularly thorny opponent. Fortunately, the old-timer knew when to cut his losses and back down. Han, on the other hand, was utterly dumbfounded. He never would have guessed that his master was such a master gambler. Surrounded by towering stacks of chips, Lucian demanded a new opponent, preferably one who could go head-to-head with him. Besides filling his pockets with winnings, he was cleaning out the fools in this casino for another reason. According to his calculations, the one he was laying a net for was about to take the bait. Just as predicted, the door to the underground casino swung open to welcome a new challenger. Lucian's prediction had been spot on. It was time to reel in this big fish. A burly man walked into the hall, drawing everyone's attention. He had a rugged look and a vicious scar running across his face. The man apologized for not immediately recognizing such a distinguished guest and for the delay in greeting him. He introduced himself as Hugo, the manager of this humble establishment. Hugo snapped his fingers and his dealers immediately sprang into action. They apologized to all the other regular customers in the casino, announcing that they had to close early today to handle some private matters. The well-trained staff politely escorted the gamblers out of the casino, not forgetting to promise them exceptionally generous treatment on their next visit. Hugo's business would suffer from upsetting the other guests, but right now that didn't matter anymore. As long as young Master Lucian could gamble comfortably in peace, it was all worth it. Lucian was genuinely impressed that Hugo recognized him even though he hadn't appeared in public for a while. But then again, that kind of sharp intuition was a mandatory requirement for survival in this underworld. The large man once again apologized for the delay in receiving him. Lucian said he just dropped by for a change of pace, so it was nothing to worry about. Hugo showered praise on the towers of chips he had accumulated. It had been a long time since a casino guest had gathered such a massive pile of winnings. If Lucian didn't mind, Hugo asked to be his next opponent at the card table. The young master smirked provocatively at the big man. "By all means, let's begin." With a standard professional smile, Hugo humbly admitted he was no match for the young master, but he would do his best to show a few tricks he had picked up. Surely a match against the casino manager would be interesting enough to kill time. Sensing the pressure radiating from the large man, Han whispered into his master's ear, pleading with him to cash in his chips and leave, because they had already won too much money. He had a very bad feeling about that scarred man. Han had met countless terrifying people in the castle, so he knew this man was not to be trifled with. Hugo's gaze in particular made Han's heart pound with fear. A gaze like that was truly rare. Lucian was very pleased to see that Han's years as a servant in a noble family hadn't been wasted. Everything Han felt with his intuition was accurate. Hugo the Black Shark might have a gentle smile on the surface, but he didn't get that nickname for nothing. In Lucian's past life, the name Hugo shook the underworld like a natural disaster. His path began in the dark alleys of a city, within the Vandex territory. He used his burly and crude body to make his enemies bleed. Armed with both violence and cunning schemes, he became an unstoppable force. It didn't take long for Hugo the Black Shark to rise to power and spread his notorious reputation. He dabbled in gambling, smuggling, and even hired assassinations. He was willing to dive into any crime that brought in the most money with his ruthless methods. He gradually expanded his territory and was dubbed the King of the Night, ruling the underworld of 5 territories later on. He would use the impending collapse of the empire as a stepping stone to emerge into the light. Through masterful political manipulations, he seized the title of Baron for himself. He was one of the first to adapt to the chaotic era, transforming into one of the most feared lords of the empire. But for now, Hugo the Black Shark was nothing more than a newcomer to the underworld. However, that didn't change the fact that he was an extremely dangerous man. Today was the day to drop the bait and catch this wild shark in these blood-soaked waters. With a deck of cards and a mountain of chips on the table, Lucian suggested they play a simple game. Hugo agreed, adding that they shouldn't set a betting limit. After all, he couldn't let the young master of the House of Vandex get bored with petty stakes. Lucian happily agreed to that condition. He was just glad to find someone who truly understood his language. In his heart, Hugo saw Lucian as just a typical show-off brat who relied on his family's name, an oblivious young beast completely unaware that its own cheerful words would become the noose tightening around its own neck. A deafening silence fell over the room as the dealer dealt cards to both of them. To be honest, he didn't expect this punk to have cleaned out all the dealers earlier. Even so, Hugo could still use Lucian's winnings to his advantage. In his eyes, an immature child drunk on a little victory would only sink deeper into tragedy. Once he started losing, Hugo was itching to strip this carefree noble brat of everything he had, one game at a time before they began playing. Lucian acted as if he had just remembered something he needed to do before they started emptying each other's pockets. Lucian wanted to ask Hugo a question. This was their first time meeting, but the young master had already taken a liking to this crime lord. One could judge a leader just by sensing the atmosphere around their subordinates. Clearly, this casino wasn't exactly a legal business. Managing an underground joint of this scale was no small feat. If Hugo had crossed the fine line of the law, the Vandex family would have surely heard about it, and a purge would have likely happened a long time ago. Hugo insisted that he knew his place and was always careful not to displease the upper class. Lucian may be from the Vandex family, but he assured the Black Shark that he wasn't the rigid old-fashioned type. Instead of beating around the bush, Lucian demanded an honest answer. He wanted to know when Hugo planned to start mass production. Without flinching in the slightest, the Black Shark asked what the boy was really referring to. When Lucian mentioned the substance being developed in Vestra, Hugo felt his stomach twist into a knot. The young master of the House of Vandex nonchalantly dropped a bombshell revealing that he knew about the hallucinogenic drug Hugo was secretly producing. That truth bomb sucked all the air out of the underground room. Even the guards standing watch outside the door were stunned. Among everyone, Han was probably the most astonished, and it showed clearly on his face. Hugo. He dropped the cards onto the table as his brain tried to piece together a proper response. In the end, he chose to play dumb, but his stammering clearly betrayed his psychological shock. While toying with the chips, Lucian pressed further with his accusation. With a cunning smile on his face, he added that he also knew. Hugo was commissioned by Marquis Lawrence to do this. The batch of hallucinogens was concocted to disrupt the Vandex territory through illegal drug distribution. He didn't think highly of the Marquis's cheap tricks at all. In his view, there was a line between noble families that should never be crossed. He asked Hugo if he shared the same thought. From Lucien's perspective on this betrayal, it made more sense to consider the Black Shark as the more formidable one. Besides him, who else would have the guts to commit a crime so heinous right in Vandex territory? If even one small mistake happened and he got caught, everyone connected to the duchy would tear him to pieces. Every power under the Grand Duke would hunt him down like a mangy dog without mercy. Right now, Hugo's mind was a tangled mess. One wrong word, and he would face death and be completely exposed. In this region, the Vandex family was the worst possible enemy one could make, normally. This matter wouldn't have come to light for another 2 years. Around that time, the Grand Duke received a detailed report on the spread of a new drug in his domain. Jack was one of the soldiers deployed to raid the Black Shark's base, but they arrived too late. Hugo had already fled the city, leaving no trace of his illegal activities in his lair. The fact that Lucien had been burned by this guy before now turned out to be incredibly useful. Even with all the cards on the table, Hugo stubbornly insisted that there must be some misunderstanding. He insisted he was just a manager used to making pocket change at a small casino, that he would never dare to get involved with drugs. He adamantly claimed that some jealous competitor must be spreading malicious rumors to ruin him. If given the chance, he promised to personally dig up the source of the rumor. Since the big guy adamantly refused to yield, Lucien added a few more details to the story. He asked Hugo if the rice mill he was running was really just a normal shop and if the secret tunnel leading outside the castle was merely a harmless escape route. For the last time, Lucien repeated his first question. Were they about to enter the mass production stage? Hugo slumped into his chair, stunned. He had no idea how he'd been checkmated like this. This brat knew everything about the front shop and the secret tunnel. If he already knew that much, then any further excuses were useless. Cornered like a wild animal, Hugo had the idea to just kill the Grand Duke's third son right here on the spot. His underlings were also clutching the weapons hidden on their bodies. A noble brat with no guards by his side would only take one strike to send him to the afterlife. Lucien calmly advised the Black Shark to think carefully. Before doing something he would regret. After all, they were betting their very lives. He reminded Hugo to consider his next move, to remember how hard he had struggled to climb to his current position. The big guy quickly dismissed the foolish thought of killing the son of Grand Duke Shichmoon. If he were caught, and the chances were high that he would be Hugo, would face a fate worse than death. A point where being granted death would be a mercy. To save his own skin, he swallowed his pride and knelt down with an extremely sincere attitude. He begged for his life to be spared from the Grand Duke's wrath. He vaguely realized there must be a reason why the young master came to find him personally instead of leading a battalion of knights to kick down his door. If anyone else in the Vandex family knew of his crimes, his head would have been lopped off long ago. At this point, if Lucien told him to be a dog, he would be a dog. If Lucien said bark, he would bark. If he said crawl, he would crawl. Hugo's underlings also lined up neatly behind their boss, kneeling and begging. The man destined to become one of the most powerful figures in the Empire's future was now in this pathetic state. After a moment of thought, Lucien leisurely stood up from his comfortable seat. Keeping such a useful dog by his side didn't sound like a bad idea at all. After all, he was in dire need of a few capable hands to command at will. Hearing this, Hugo swore to obey his every word. But Lucian didn't want someone of Hugo's caliber to stop at just that. That would be boring. He knew full well the black shark would never be content with the life of a mere hunting dog. Looking straight into the eyes of the man groveling before him, Lucian offered a better deal for both of them. He asked Hugo if he would like to try becoming a knight. Just hearing those two words was enough to stir emotions buried deep in the black shark's heart. Like many other boys, he too had once desperately yearned for the dream of becoming a knight, but in the end he had no choice but to give up on that fanciful dream. As time went on, the harsh reality of life crushed him more and more. No matter how much he honed his skills, how strong he became, or how many times he put his life on the line for his masters, in their eyes he was forever just a lowly commoner. He was just a convenient tool, a piece of muscle for those with real power to use and exploit. Due to factors beyond his control, due to his humble origins, he could never reach his dream, no matter how much blood he shed. To answer Lucien's question, of course he wanted to be a knight. He craved it so much that he was willing to smash his head on the ground just for the chance to wear a knight's armor. If he could achieve that dream, he, would even sell his soul to anyone who could make it a reality. Before Lucien now was a weak man desperately clinging to his childhood dream. In the name of the honor of the Vandex family, he promised to help Hugo become a true knight if he possessed the quality and self-respect to never be ashamed. To avoid feeling ashamed of his future self, Hugo knew that his shell of a mundane identity could no longer be a barrier. In that moment, Lucien's dazzling figure was forever etched into Hugo's mind. He had given Hugo the chance to live like a human being, not merely a tool. A few days after their clash at the casino, Lucien summoned all the servants to his annex. With Hugo at his side, he introduced the newest member of his growing force to the servants, touting him as an exceptional talent recruited from the outside. In contrast to his master's calm demeanor, Hugo introduced himself with a powerful and confident voice, saying he was looking forward to working with his new seniors. But his thuggish face made the servants shudder. The maids and butlers were flustered, not knowing how to react to the young master's abrupt announcement. After the greetings, Lucien intended to move straight to the main event. He ordered his men to immediately bring the head maid Jenny to his office. The butlers immediately flinched upon hearing the young master's order. Lucien made the excuse that it was only natural to introduce the new recruit to the head maid. After all, they couldn't have a noisy conversation like last time. He simply wanted to be the first one to deliver the news to the ever-so-busy Miss Jenny. As expected, the servants all reacted as if they took orders from the head maid, not him. The internal situation was already a complete mess, so much so that it couldn't be fixed by ordinary means. Not a single maid or butler paid any mind to his command. To them, Lucien was nothing more than a rotten rope, completely helpless. He would have to stage a show of force powerful enough to win back control of his own home. A butler stepped forward and begged Lucien to consider their situation. Everyone in this annex knew that the head maid Jenny was favored by the other young Master Geordie. She had seized complete authority in the house, and she had manipulated the staff. The butlers and maids dared to oppose their useless master because he was insisting on lighting a fuse and putting them in a difficult position. They would rather live peacefully like before. Back when the young master of this house was just rotting away in his bed, Lucien couldn't stand to hear any more of these lowly servants' deceitful words. He roared, ordering them to open their damn eyes and remember the duty they had long forgotten. The master of this house is young Master Lucien, not that red-headed bitch or that arrogant Geordie. After observing this little comedy from the sidelines, Hugo had a firm grasp of the situation and offered a simple solution, seeing as the young master's sharp words were wasted on these servants. For these simpletons, he could provide a much more effective alternative. He'd heard enough and knew exactly what needed to be done. Hugo assured his master that he would personally take care of this problem. For those who no longer recognize their place in the hierarchy, the method for beating loyalty into them is actually quite simple. He reported that his method might be a little violent, and so he required his boss's permission. Lucien was very pleased with how quickly Hugo's mind worked. That was the main reason he went to all the trouble of recruiting this giant. This time, luck was truly on his side. Hugo was still only in the early stages of concocting that drug. If things had gone any further, he never would have had the chance to bring the black shark to his side. With absolute confidence, he gave Hugo permission to do exactly what they were both thinking. He gave his new confidant the green light to crank the intensity up to the highest possible level. To kick things off, Hugo strode toward the butler, who was loudly protesting. He towered over the short servant. Seeing the black shark up close like this, anyone would tremble in fear. His massive build and intense gaze overwhelmed the senses. He looked exactly like the kind of monster capable of committing the most heinous crimes. The butler told himself that Lucian must have scraped some trashy thug out of a back alley. He smugly took it upon himself to lecture the stupid giant as someone who understood how things really worked in this house. He also warned Hugo to be smart and choose the right side. The smug butler deliberately tried to intimidate Hugo by mentioning the cruelty of the two Geordie masters. All of these servants were convinced that the balance of power had long since tipped away from Lucian. Surely that giant thug wouldn't be stupid enough to risk his life over a few measly coins. Right. Hugo found the pompous butler's empty words pathetic. His fist crashed directly into the butler's face, landing a devastating blow. With just one punch, it was enough to reshape the man's skull. The force behind it was so immense that it sent the insolent butler flying into the nearest wall like a rag doll. His eyes practically bulged out of their sockets while Lucian smirked, proud to have hired such a monster. Hugo slowly walked over to the butler's limp body. Just a single casual punch was enough to violently reboot his system. The other butlers cried out in fear. They criticized the newcomer for daring to use violence in the castle. The black shark was completely unfazed by their hollow, feeble words. As it happened, Hugo was an expert at teaching stubborn bastards a lesson. This was the perfect first mission for him. A moment later, not a single sign of resistance remained among the servants. They even obeyed the young master's orders to escort the head maid Jenny here, using force when necessary. With a clear slap mark on her face, Jenny snarled and asserted that they would regret treating her this way. But instead of cowering before her empty threats, the newly disciplined butlers told her to shut her mouth and get moving. Accustomed to being in charge, she couldn't stand being yelled at. She kept rambling on about punishing anyone who defied her, only to fall silent when the door to Lucian's office opened. Before her was a ludicrous sight. All the maids and butlers under her command were forced to kneel on the floor, reflecting on their mistakes. The fear they once had for Jenny had been completely crushed by the terror Hugo had inflicted. Meanwhile, the young master stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, radiating an overwhelming aura of power and authority. He turned to look at the restrained head maid, smiling and giving a little wave. He was delighted to see his underlings finally doing their duty. Lucian noticed the slap mark on her cheek and simply clicked his tongue, overlooking his subordinate's excessive enthusiasm. Jenny exploded with rage, confident that this pathetic young master wouldn't get away with treating her like this. She refused to bow before Lucian, like the others, repeating over and over that her masters, the two Geordie masters, would never let this slide. She even had the audacity to declare that if they stopped now, she would let the matter drop. All Lucian could do was laugh. He casually picked up the whip from his desk and advanced on the defiant maid. Why end the fun when it was just getting started? The day is still young, and my whip hand is getting itchy. He urged the head maid, Jenny, to say whatever she wanted. She should get all her complaints out while she still could, because before this day was over, she'd be knocking on hell's door. Public punishment is an ancient method for deterring troublemakers. It's both for show and highly effective. The sword is swung in the name of righteous justice. It strikes a clear target, and above all, it leaves an unforgettable impression on those who witness the blade fall. In other words, it's a time-tested ritual. Lucian, gripping the whip tightly, slowly approached the head maid, Jenny. She glared at him, her eyes filled with contempt and disgust. He met her gaze with a look of pure indifference. There wasn't the slightest flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Today he would send a message to the Grand Duke. The weak and pathetic third son was no more. He beckoned to his butlers with a single finger. They seized Jenny, holding her firmly in place and forcing her to her knees. The very woman who just minutes earlier had held absolute control over the entire household was now pinned down, unable to move. Yet even at this disadvantage, she still had the nerve to shout her defiance at Lucian, refusing to believe that this brat actually had the guts to follow through on his threats. She was convinced that if anyone dared to harm a single hair on her head, the two Geordie masters would never stand idly by. Jenny, while boastfully, tried to use the fact that her mother had been the Geordis wet nurse as leverage. They had grown up together as close as siblings. By now, Lucian had grown tired of her empty threats. This was her last chance to repent, yet she stubbornly kept repeating the same old tired lines. If she were to die uselessly screaming his brothers' names until the very end, wouldn't that make her entire existence a complete joke? If Jenny had any other cards to play, now was the time to show them. But like a broken record, she just kept screeching about what the two Geordie masters would do. Lucian had to step in to correct her twisted worldview. He had more than enough justification to take her life. She was accused of slandering the nobility and neglecting her duties. instigating rebellion and embezzlement. With such a long list of crimes, she must have been insane to believe her little nanny and child relationship with Geordie could save her neck. She was gravely mistaken about her place in this world. At most, the Geordie she kept parading around could only slap Lucian a few times, and that was it. And if the Grand Duke got involved, he couldn't even do that. On the contrary, their father might even reward Lucian for smoothly dealing with a spreading disease that was causing internal problems within the family. Jenny must have forgotten that Geordie is just another heir to the Duke, the one standing right in front of her. During their first encounter, Lucian gave her a chance to clear things up fairly. Instead of taking it, she chose to act high and mighty with a brazenly insolent attitude. She brought this all on herself. Hearing the third young master lay out all the facts shattered her delusions. For the first time since being dragged here, Jenny trembled in absolute terror. Desperately looking for a way out, she confessed and begged for her life. Unfortunately, she could only blame her own bad luck. Lucian swung the whip with all his might. The sound of tearing flesh and splattering blood echoed throughout the office. News of Jenny's capture quickly reached the second young master. Along with his knights, Geordie rushed to Lucian's office, anxiety clear on his face. He couldn't believe that his useless little brother would dare to use such drastic measures. Just a few days ago, he heard Jenny report that the brat had retreated after being humiliated in the servants' quarters. Yet now he was threatening to kill anyone who dared to oppose him. That wasn't the only thing confusing Geordie. To prepare for a situation like this, he had planted a few of his people in Lucian's villa. The servants he'd planted there should have done everything in their power to stop Lucian and side with Jenny. Yet things had become irreversible in just one day. Lucian had seized complete control of the entire villa, including those who were supposed to obey Geordie. The knights reassured their young master that the reports must be mistaken, so they should calm down a bit. They argued that a coward like Lucian wouldn't have the guts to harm anyone. Moreover, they still believed the third young master feared their master Geordie more than anything in the world. After hearing that reasonable argument, Geordie gradually calmed down, until they heard the sound of a whip tearing through flesh, followed by a bone-chilling scream of agony. Geordie violently kicked the office door open. His eyes immediately darted to the whip, dripping with fresh red blood onto the floor. Lucian was standing behind Jenny. Her back was covered in gruesome, tattered lacerations. Fresh blood oozed endlessly from the gaping wounds. It was a scene Geordie could never have imagined, not even in a million years. Even someone as ruthless as Geordie was stunned by the gory scene. When he spoke, announcing his presence, Lucian just flatly asked what wind had brought his esteemed second brother to his domain. He apologized for not being able to welcome them properly. He was a bit busy at the moment, so it would be best if Geordie and his knights came back later. Uprooting the seeds of rebellion in one's own house could sometimes be a difficult sight for some people to swallow. Ignoring his brother's presence, he ordered Hugo to make Jenny stand up straight again. The second young master immediately ordered his knights Oliver and Gert to rush in and bring Jenny to him. Oliver and Gert obeyed their master and darted forward. In response, Lucian gave Hugo a cold command laced with killing intent. If anyone had dared to come within 3 steps of his position, Hugo was free to slit the maid's throat. Lucian would gladly take full responsibility for whatever happened afterward. Meeting his crazed eyes, Oliver and Gert immediately froze in their tracks. With the sharp blade in his hand, Hugo assured his boss that he would handle the throat slitting so that young Master Lucian could rest easy. The tip of the blade grazed Jenny's skin, causing more blood to flow. All she could do was scream and cry for help from the second young master, her beloved Geordie. The second young master demanded the black shark put down the knife immediately. He declared that if he didn't comply, not only Hugo's head, but his entire family's would also fall. Their severed heads would be hung on the city walls. Hugo didn't even blink at Geordie's cheap threat. His master was young Master Lucian. He had no reason to obey anyone else. No matter what happened later, he would fulfill his duty and follow his master's will. Geordie immediately realized he had no authority in this situation. He turned to Lucian, questioning his younger brother about what Jenny had done to deserve such a cruel punishment. Young Master Lucian quickly listed her crimes, insulting a superior, defying orders, and dipping her hands into the family's funds. He was just meting out a fitting punishment. He advised his brother to come to his senses and clearly distinguish between public and private matters. By doing so, he pushed Geordie into a dilemma. According to the Van Dijk family's current succession structure, the first in line was the eldest young master, Tristan Van Dijk, followed closely by the second young master, Geordie Van Dijk. A power struggle. between the two was clearly established. In other words, until the final confrontation, the most important thing for Geordie was to consolidate his power. Being publicly humiliated by his own younger brother recently had already cost him dearly. He'd had to cast aside Hendrik, one of his trusted knights. If he couldn't protect Jenny, who was considered his right hand, his position in the succession race would be shaken. His incompetence would be a turning point leading to doubt and fractures that could easily form and spread among his subordinates. In other words, he was in complete checkmate. Realizing this, Geordie conceded to Lucian and earnestly begged for Jenny's life. His knights and all the servants in the room were stunned. But Hugo was on another level. He kept his eyes glued to his prey, his hand never leaving the blade. Lucian found his brother's melodramatic performance ridiculous. A single word from that bastard was nowhere near enough to let this go. After letting someone trash his precious villa, how could mere words be enough? Geordie must think his tongue is plated in gold or something. Once again, he proved that all nobles were cut from the same cloth. For now, you just have to play along with him, so you ask Geordie what conceding the victory would even mean to him in this situation. There's no victory to be won. Lucian was simply fulfilling his duty as the third young master, nothing more, nothing less. Besides, the headmaid had committed unforgivable crimes, regardless of her status. If they just covered this up and let it go, what would people think of the Van Dijk family? Lucian insisted that he also wanted to let the matter die down, but the law had tied his hands. There was simply no reason to go against principles and turn a blind eye to such blatant violations. Geordie gritted his teeth and clenched his fists. He pressured Lucian to stop beating around the bush and state his demands directly. The third young master cited that since ancient times, the act of coveting another's property has often been punished in a similar fashion. Perhaps he would be willing to overlook this matter if the culprit returned many times the amount that was stolen. If he received a satisfactory price, Lucian could be magnanimous enough to forgive and forget. Now it all depended on whether Geordie was willing to cough up a huge sum of money. After the disturbance settled down, everything in the Van Dijk estate returned to normal. Grand Duke Sigmund Van Dijk was contemplating what had happened between his sons. The head butler, Edwin, had reported the incident to him in detail, as well as how it was resolved. Initially, the Grand Duke felt the need to verify if every word in the report was accurate. Edwin was the one who had verified this report, so Sigmund could be certain it was the truth. In the end, Geordie had agreed to compensate Lucian with a large sum of money, 10 times the amount of the stolen pocket money. Edwin's report also mentioned young Master Lucian's new recruit, a man named Hugo, who had quickly rooted out all the spies planted in Lucian's annex. As a result, the third young master had completely regained control of his residence, making it more heavily guarded than any other area in the castle. After meeting with Edwin and understanding the facts, Grand Duke Sigmund summoned Lucian for a talk. Obeying his father's command, the third young master went to his father's office as quickly as possible. Sigmund glanced at his son and sensed that the look in his eyes was different now. The Grand Duke asked about the mess he had caused recently. Lucian corrected his father, asserting that it wasn't simply a mess. He was merely disciplining the servants who didn't even recognize their master's authority. But in doing so, you've embarrassed your older brother. Sigmund warned that Geordie wouldn't forget this easily. For a long time, he wasn't sure if his third son could withstand this pressure. Lucian dismissed the idea that there was anything worth resolving. He maintained his stance that he was only upholding the proper order, as is the way of the nobility. If he were to shirk such an obvious duty just for fear of future consequences, then how could he proudly bear the name Van Dijk? He simply made a choice that wouldn't tarnish the family's honor. His father seemed to like that answer. The Grand Duke warned that Geordie would continue to look for trouble in the future. Lucian had every right to fight back if that happened. However, he had to remember not to push the conflict so far that it harmed the family and their reputation. Sigmund also stressed that he would side with Geordie regardless of who was right or wrong. Lucian immediately protested such blatant favoritism. His father simply told him not to be surprised by this decision. Geordie could be impetuous at times, but he was a talented leader and a great contributor to the family. In contrast, Lucian had thrown away an entire year living idly instead of atoning for his sins with accomplishments. As the head of the family, it was only natural to protect someone who actively contributes to the family. His words sounded cruel, but Lucian could understand the deeper meaning within. If he wasn't mistaken, it seemed his father was implicitly telling him to step on his brother to climb higher. Grand Duke Sigmund wanted him to consolidate his power and actively contribute to the Van Dijk family. Just do that. Then you will find the answer to your questions. Lucian realized this man was trying to heighten his sense of threat, forcing him to run even faster. If he made such a firm declaration at this moment, it meant the succession structure would soon be decided. In a very roundabout way, he felt moved by his father's indirect advice to seize every opportunity, to rise above his brothers before it was too late. He wondered if all fathers were like this, if the Grand Duke was this concerned for his son. Lucian decided he would throw him a juicy bone and score some points with him in the process. He pushed a file of documents across his father's desk and showed the Grand Duke his next move. It was an incredibly shocking move. The Grand Duke picked up the documents and scanned the contents. As he analyzed each line of truth, rage slowly consumed him. His hand crushed the paper, utterly stunned by what he had just read. He hurriedly asked his son if this information was truly accurate. If Lucian had fabricated this report out of an ambitious desire for credit, he had to tell the truth right now. But every line in that document was the truth without a single word of falsehood. Furthermore, he had captured a spy who was tasked with distributing this drug under the orders of Marquis Laudegran. He urged his father to launch a full-scale investigation. Judging from the Grand Duke's reaction, he was prepared to do much more than just an investigation. The room was filled with a suffocating atmosphere emanating from Sigmund. His rage was leaking out in the form of mana. He cursed Bernhard Laudegran, that shameless, brazen son of a marquis, a fellow noble who dared to taint Van Dijk, territory with dangerous, forbidden drugs. This could absolutely not be overlooked. For the first time, Lucian felt the power of the sword that protects the Empire. The head of the Van Dijk family was not someone to be trifled with. At this rate, he might get caught in the crossfire. Understanding his father's rage, Lucian spoke up boldly. He anticipated that even if they reported this to the Emperor, the Laudegran family would still have enough time to sacrifice a pawn and escape blame. All involvement was carried out through subsidiary merchant guilds, the Bajawan Merchant Guild. On the surface, there was no trace of the Marquis's direct involvement. Furthermore, the more they pushed and dug, the worse things would get. Currently, the Emperor is wary of factional conflicts, and the Empire would surely force itself to mediate and intervene. After calming down a bit, Sigmund, he was impressed by his son Lucien's sharp political insight, who argued that even though the Marquis had committed an outrageous act against their great family, Lygren would only receive a light token punishment, perhaps a small fine, and nothing more. To commit such a heinous crime against House Van Dijk, shouldn't they at least have to leave an arm behind? After a moment of reflection on his son's proposal, the Grand Duke sat down and reined in his surging emotions. He wanted to hear in detail how this kid planned to handle such a delicate situation. Fortunately, Lucien was prepared. He already had a way to lay a trap for the Marquis. The plan revolved around an inside man he had just recruited, Hugo. Though this man held no title, he had earned Lygren's deep trust, quickly rising to the rank of manager. Sigmund recalled hearing something about the man. He remembered this outsider from the head butler's summary report. He couldn't help but feel as if his son had foreseen this situation from the very beginning. Using a traitor to lay a counter-trap was indeed a fascinating idea. From the Marquis's perspective, it would be difficult to imagine being betrayed by a loyal manager. Lucien had already paved the way. He would make it seem as if the drug's production was proceeding smoothly. Before long, a key figure from the Lygren family would have to appear in person. Considering the political implications of this plan, this matter absolutely could not be taken lightly. Lucien's move sounded ideal, but the plan had a fatal flaw. They were essentially betting everything on a single variable, a traitor from the underworld. The Grand Duke reminded his son that human nature is an unpredictable thing and that you cannot walk side by side with such an untrustworthy man. Lucien countered that he didn't trust the man himself, but rather the burning desire deep within him. Hugo was the kind of man willing to risk everything, to become a knight, to make his name renowned throughout the Empire. He carried within him a fierce motivation to carve his name into the history books. That was something they could trust, in a man who was madly chasing a dream. Lucien was willing to place his bet on that dream, because in his past life he himself had been such a foolish dreamer. It was a deeply sentimental reason which made the Grand Duke hesitate to lend his support. If this move were to fail, Lucien had no intention of evading responsibility. He would ultimately bear the burden of his subordinate's mistake. Even if it meant betting his own life, he was willing to make that trade. Sigmund could see that his son was truly serious about every word he said. For the time being, he decided to give the idea more thought. Once Lucien's body had recovered, he ordered him to the training grounds. The Grand Duke finally deemed him worthy of the Lionheart sword. From this moment forward, Lucien would be officially recognized as a candidate for the next head of the family. Late that night, Sigmund was still working diligently in his study. He recounted his discussion with Lucien to Edwin, and the head butler apologized profusely for his grave oversight. The old man was deeply ashamed that such a terrible incident had occurred right here in Keohem, the heart of the Van Dox family, without his knowledge. The Grand Duke took responsibility, saying he was the one who had ordered Edwin to focus solely on border issues. The head butler was already burdened with too many responsibilities as it was. Fortunately, Lucien exposed this wretched scheme before it spiraled out of control. After all, Bernhard Ligren had gone to great lengths to cover his tracks. The purpose of this drug? It wasn't profit or the expansion of power. Clearly, it was born from an extreme malice intended to tarnish the reputation of House Van Dox. The Ligrens must have intended to use these dirty tricks as a pretext to orchestrate more profound schemes later on. Even knowing the Empire's current state, some nobles are still blinded by power. More importantly, Sigmund wanted a more detailed report on this man, Hugo. According to Edwin's findings, Hugo appeared to be just a nameless thug who managed a casino, but in reality, he was the leader of a new emerging organization that was dominating the underworld at a dizzying speed. In theory, he wasn't the type of man to bow to anyone. This only made the achievement of the third young master taming the black shark all the more impressive. Edwin attributed that brilliant move to Lucien's remarkable growth. The Grand Duke couldn't help but feel that there was more to Lucien's change than met the eye. Hugo had survived and clawed his way through the underworld, a place where cunning and cruelty reigned supreme. If he were merely a fool who believed in empty promises about fulfilling a childhood dream, he would have been trampled to death long ago. That crafty criminal must have seen Lucien's true potential, a master worthy of staking his life on. Although it was sooner than he'd intended, because Lucien continuously revealed his talent. Sigmund saw that it was time to pave the way for him. Starting tomorrow, the Grand Duke intended to pass down the family's secret arts to this once-forgotten third son. As for who would serve as his swordmaster, Sigmund already had someone in mind, Sir Eisen, a name that every swordsman in the Empire knew by heart. He felt guilty about disturbing the old man's peace in his twilight years, but he was certain that taking Lucien as a disciple would be a meaningful experience for him as well. It was time to pull Sir Eisen out of his elderly seclusion. News of Lucien's official recognition as a candidate for family head reached his residence. Han couldn't believe that the young master, who had been so pathetic and miserable just a short while ago, had now completely turned his life around. The attendant clung to Lucien, bawling like a child. Hugo lifted him up effortlessly as if the man weighed nothing. Despite the vast difference in their physiques and experience, Hugo respectfully addressed Han as senior. The Black Shark believed that with the young master's talent, his selection as the heir was only natural. Thinking of his master's future path to supremacy, he urged Senior Han to start acting like the master's right-hand man. Being called the young master's right-hand man filled Han's head with magnificent delusions. He couldn't hide the huge grin that spread from ear to ear, though he humbly replied that he still had many shortcomings, especially with a talented junior like Hugo around. How could he dare claim such a title for himself? Hugo immediately played along with Han's false modesty, praising him to the heavens while bouncing him up and down like a child. The way the Black Shark responded to Han truly showed the difference of a seasoned veteran. Lucien also voiced his agreement with Hugo's words before the news was officially announced to the rest of the Han family. He and Hugo were the first to hear it from Lucien's lips. He had to admit that sometimes Han's gentle nature was seen as a weakness. Nevertheless, this kid genuinely cared for his young master. He had enough courage to steadfastly stay by Lucien's side even in the darkest of days. If he gained more experience and continued to mature, he had the potential to be outstanding in managing internal affairs. He would become a rearguard, more solid and trustworthy than anyone. As for Hugo, his abilities were undeniable. Lucien just needed to clear the path for him to reach the knight's seat. If he could do that, Hugo's talent would be unleashed to its fullest potential. The Black Shark would become an invaluable asset in the future, serving as Lucien's sharpest sword. At this moment, it was better to prioritize quality over quantity when building his inner circle. Methodically nurturing his confidants in the best way possible was the key to achieving victory. With Lucien's status elevated, things would get much busier. He wouldn't be able to handle everything on his own on the journey ahead. But with these two by his side, he would surely reach a brighter future. Hugo swore he would never disappoint him. The weight of his oath was palpable. Han also promised to be as reliable as ever. The very next morning, Lucian woke up early and eagerly headed to the training grounds. Standing alone in the middle of the arena, he completely savored the scenery and the atmosphere here. Lucian closed his eyes and reflected on his previous life. Back then, he had tirelessly scoured every corner of the continent for just one thing. He had bravely ventured through the harshest regions of the Empire in search of the ancestral essence of martial arts, which was said to elevate a swordsman to a higher realm. He was once obsessed with the concept of sword techniques. Among the countless existing sword techniques, there was a higher-class, high-level sword techniques. He had struggled like a dog, but at the end of his search what he found was not the high-level sword technique he so desperately craved, nor was it the intermediate-level sword technique that knight captains often mastered. The only fruit of all his efforts was just an outdated version for knight apprentices. He was slapped hard by the harsh reality that true strength could not be achieved without a noble bloodline. Even the small chance to learn an outdated sword technique as a lowly mercenary was considered a stroke of immense luck every time he failed to protect his comrades on the battlefield. He was painfully reminded of his own insignificance. He was further tormented by an intense thirst for a true sword technique. The things he had once craved so much in the past were now within his grasp. Passed down only to the successor candidates of the Van Detch family and their closest aides, it was a sword technique. So ancient, it surpassed even the high-level sword techniques. Today was the day he would have the chance to learn the much-coveted Lionheart sword technique. His mind was spinning with all sorts of possibilities. Just how great of a swordsman could he truly become? Knowing he was just a few steps away from his dream, he suddenly felt nervous even before he had begun. It was still quite a while until his lesson, but he had been excited since dawn, so much so that he had been pacing around the arena for hours. It would be much better to spend that time calming his mind by circulating his mana before the lesson started. In his previous life, without proper training, he had to learn swordsmanship by peeking or piecing together scraps of knowledge. He never had anyone to call a master. Day by day, he grew more appreciative of the one-of-a-kind second chance he'd been given. Lucian sat in the middle of the arena cross-legged in a meditative pose, unaware that someone was observing from above, silently watching Lucian as he meditated in absolute stillness. That person was none other than Sir Ison. He had been watching for a while, but the boy's concentration hadn't wavered in the slightest. He guessed that something must have stimulated the young master to shed his former self. The boy who used to just cower and hide had now become a disciplined young man. Initially, Sir Ison was quite surprised by the Grand Duke's summons and his offer to become Lucian's swordsmanship instructor. Grand Duke Sigmund admitted that he had once nearly given up on this child. He had thought the boy was a lost cause, but looking at the person Lucian was now, he had recognized countless precious qualities in the kid. The Grand Duke offered this job as a small pastime for the old man. Sir Ison trusted Sigmund's eye for people and his ability to recognize outstanding talent. But more than talent, there was something else that had attracted the Grand Duke. What truly surprised him was Lucian's mindset. He couldn't put it into words, but he was certain that Sir Ison would understand what he meant as soon as he met the boy in person. Back in the present, the sword Saint Ison printer was witnessing exactly what Sigmund had described. In this world, a sword saint is a superhuman who has reached the ultimate limit of mana circulation, one of the few rare individuals who has achieved a full awakening. It is a supreme title bestowed upon those who have reached the absolute pinnacle of swordsmanship. In the Empire's long history, only a few rare individuals have reached that peak. To swordsmen across the Empire, they are akin to gods. Such a legendary figure was standing right in front of Lucian. The young master's jaw dropped in clear astonishment. It's not every day you get to see a god. The sword Saint Ison printer looked like an old man with pure white hair dressed in a common training uniform. He bowed politely to Lucian. It had been several years since they last met at Lucian's birthday party. He courteously introduced himself as if he weren't one of the most infamous warriors in the kingdom. Han had mentioned that Lucian was assigned to learn swordsmanship from a knight who had served the family Van Detch for 2 generations. That attendant had conveniently omitted the detail that the knight was the great sword saint himself. Lucian had to suppress his fanboy excitement and returned the gesture with a standard noble's bow expressing his great honor at being taught by the sword saint himself. Ison chuckled upon hearing such a formal greeting. He grumbled that nowadays he was nothing more than an old man, hiding behind an exaggerated title. Besides, a candidate to become the future head of a great family should not bow his head so easily. Lucian countered that while he had a duty to protect his family's dignity, you would also never be disrespectful to someone as esteemed as the Sword Saint. Regardless of their master-servant relationship, Icon was still a person worthy of the utmost respect. Seeing the boy's eyes, sparkling with admiration, made the old man feel a bit flustered. He decided to indulge him and let the young lord behave in whatever way he felt most comfortable. Wasting no more time, their first training session officially began. Icon instructed Lucian to run laps around the outdoor training grounds, but he had barely finished giving the first assignment. When the young lord was already poised to run with the utmost enthusiasm, he looked to his instructor awaiting the permissive nod. Stunned by his eagerness, the old man told him to wait a moment. Icon found it odd that the boy didn't ask a single question. Why do I have to run? How far? What's the point of this particular training exercise? Most noble children would have bombarded him with a barrage of the same old questions, all before they'd even put in any effort. Of course, Lucian was curious too, but he figured he was ordered to run simply because it was necessary. He believed that a disciple's only job was to obey his master's words and trust in the training process. Icon noticed a distinct difference in Lucian's eyes compared to the other young lords. This boy possessed a pure and sincere passion for the sword. He finally understood the Duke's hidden meaning from their meeting. Without further hesitation, he signaled for Lucian to run with all his might. With an enthusiastic smile, Lucian stepped out onto the sun-drenched training grounds. As he ran laps around the training field, Icon watched quietly from a distance. Lucian was performing this simple running exercise with the utmost seriousness. Every one of his strides was rhythmic, his pace gradually increasing. In truth, there was another reason he followed Master Icon's orders without a hint of hesitation. He had already seen through the true purpose of this run. He was given a tedious physical task to assess his aptitude as a disciple. In other words, it was a test of his potential. Lucian knew this, because he had used a similar tactic back when he was a mercenary captain. He would often assign new recruits menial chores, the manual labor no one else wanted to do. Then, he'd stand back and watch. Simply by observing their reactions and attitude toward a menial task, an instructor could understand a great deal about a new recruit. Ready to pass this simple test with flying colors, Lucian showed his determination by dedicating 100% of his energy to the task. He was acutely aware that Icon was observing his every move. Since he'd already shown the Sword Saint a perfect mindset with his satisfactory answer, there was only one thing left to prove: his endurance. Today, Lucian was determined to run until he was completely exhausted and collapsed. That was the plan. But after only 1 hour of training, he started to feel that something was very wrong. He had been running his heart out for the past 60 minutes, yet he didn't feel the slightest bit tired. In fact, the more he ran, the stronger he felt. With every lap around the field, his body felt a little lighter and more agile. It was an incredibly strange experience. All he'd done to recover his ruined body so far was use a mass-produced type of nita. The only exercise he'd done was take gentle strolls around the castle. By now, even the Sword Saint realized something was strange. He had only wanted to assess the young lord's overall physical condition. He didn't have high expectations. And yet this child was demonstrating monstrously resilient stamina. Given Lucian's past, this performance completely defied all logic. Not a single drop of sweat fell from his body, and his breathing was as calm as a placid lake. Even for knights who had trained their mana for years, this level of composure was unheard of. He began to grow restless, just watching passively from a distance. The Sword Saint realized something. Before he had arrived, the young lord had been sitting in a meditative state. To confirm his hunch, Master Icon strode onto the training field with a fluid motion. He ordered Lucian to stop and end the exercise. The young lord worried something was wrong, that he had made a mistake. Right in front of him, the Sword Saint was radiating pure mana from his entire body. Icon wanted to ask the young lord one thing before they continued. He pressed him, asking if the exercise Lucian performed earlier to calm his mind and regulate his body was a mana circulation and not just simple meditation. Seeing no reason to hide his training, the young lord confirmed the Sword Saint's hunch. He had used mana circulation because there was nothing better to clear his mind. With that confirmation, Icon asked to check Lucian's physical condition for a moment. He took the boy's hand and told Lucian to remain still even if he felt some strange sensations. With masterful control and precision, Master Icon steadily guided his own mana through the young lord's wrist, thereby gaining access to the boy's circulatory pathways. The examination dragged on for an uncomfortably long time. Finally, the Sword Saint pinpointed the exact reason for Lucian's superhuman stamina. Just as he'd suspected the young lord, Lucian had reached the final stage of circulation. They were on the same level. But that wasn't all. The boy had reached a realm beyond, the theoretical limit, something even a sword saint like Eisen had never managed to do. This child was actively forging a new path far beyond what was thought possible. After completing his examination, Eisen simply stood motionless for a moment. He gently withdrew his mana and let go of the young lord's hand. With trembling hands, he asked Lucian how long he had been practicing circulation, and when he had reached the final stage of the process. The young lord was completely stunned by the strange question. Clearly, he had no idea what he had just accomplished. In the Sword Saint's assessment, the purity of his mana was like freshly fallen snow on a pristine winter field, utterly untainted. His mana core was perfectly formed, to maximize efficiency like a perpetual motion fountain. He had reached a realm that only a handful of warriors ever achieve. Many people could train their entire lives and never even dream of catching up to Lucian, let alone imagine this. But he never expected he was already so close to a state of perfection. He didn't need to hide anything from his new master anymore. He had a ton of questions about his own condition, questions that only someone like the Sword Saint could answer. Lucien confessed that about a month ago, he had started circulating his mana instinctively, and discovered that all of his channels had been open from the very beginning. He'd heard that circulation was supposed to come with pain and blockages, yet he hadn't experienced any resistance or discomfort whatsoever. This child had far surpassed the Sword Saint's expectations. He himself was considered a genius, but he had only reached the peak after many decades of arduous training. Looking at the young master, he thought that perhaps the legendary swordsmen who could split mountains and part seas weren't just myths. Maybe they truly existed. Eisen put on a serious expression and asked to speak frankly. Though it might sound insolent, he asked if young Master Lucien would consider giving up his position as the successor to the Vandeck family to walk a different path. Lucien was horrified by the old man's proposal. Why would he have to give up the position of successor that he had just barely secured? He feared there was something wrong with his body. Maybe he couldn't learn swordsmanship, or something terrible would happen if he used mana. Eisen reassured him that the truth was the complete opposite of his worries. He bluntly declared that Lucian's body was proof of the most perfect physique. Not only could it push the efficiency of his mana and body beyond their theoretical limits, he also possessed the potential to see beyond the peak and shatter all common sense. In other words, if the young master focused solely on honing his swordsmanship, becoming a sword saint would be within his grasp. As someone who had always craved the pinnacle of the sword path, being told he could become a sword saint was a dream come true. He knew Lucian's body was extraordinary, but this was beyond his wildest dreams. Thanks to his luck in learning the Lionheart sword style, Lucian had thought he had found a way to make his impossible dreams a reality. Who would have thought he had the potential to surpass even that realm? A straight path to the pinnacle of swordsmanship. Based on the fact that Eisen was making him choose between his family and becoming a sword saint instead of walking both paths at once. The process must be truly arduous. Master Eisen confirmed that he could only focus on one path. To be more precise, the old man simply didn't have much time left in this world. Thanks to the power of circulation, he could still move his old bones. Even though he was nearly 100 years old, time spares no one. He couldn't deny that aging was slowly wearing down his body. To pass everything on to the next sword saint while he still breathed, even focusing solely on swordsmanship would barely be enough time. If Lucian's memory served him right, the sword saint would pass away within 8 years. Indeed, they didn't have much time. In his heart, Lucien desperately wanted to accept Master Eisen's offer and devote himself to swordsmanship. However, the coming age of chaos would bring a world that couldn't be changed by force alone. Those who could survive the great upheaval that would sweep across the entire continent all possessed legitimacy and noble titles. Although the moment he had longed for was within reach, he had to think of the bigger picture. He apologized to Sir Eisen. He had finally decided he would remain a Vandeck until the very end. The Sword Saint had offered him a chance far beyond his current status, a responsibility he couldn't accept. Fortunately, the old man understood his concerns. He was the one who had pushed this child into a dilemma. He lamented wasting his youth only to become greedy when he was already at death's door. Somehow, he wanted to leave behind an eternal legacy through Lucian after he was gone. Seeing the old man lost in thought about his long life and his legacy, an idea sparked in Lucian's mind. He asked the Sword Saint what he would do if someone else with true talent appeared someone other than him. Far from the Vandeck estate in the middle of a dense forest, the sound of galloping hooves could be heard. Riding a powerful war horse was a young man dressed in noble attire. His ride was interrupted by a servant who rushed into the clearing. The servant gasped for breath as he reported news concerning the third son of the Vandeck family. The aggressive young noble reined in his horse. He couldn't believe that the ridiculous stories he'd been hearing were true. The fourth son of the Vandeck family, Joshua Vandeck, refused to accept that his idiotic older brother was now recognized as a new candidate for the position of family head. His servant explained in detail that the rumors had been confirmed. The Grand Duke himself had just made the announcement. Moreover, young Master Lucien was currently undergoing training. In swordsmanship under the guidance of Sir Eisen, Joshua was furious. His entire life, he had only ever seen his brother as a burden. Building a power base while being squeezed by his two older brothers was already difficult enough. Now even the neutral factions had a new choice to rally behind. He would have preferred it if Lucien had just continued to rot in his room. The attendant advised him to be careful with his words. How could Joshua remain calm when the support he had painstakingly pieced together could crumble at any moment? It was infuriating enough to have to call Lucien older brother when they were only a few months apart. The fact that the third young master was now officially recognized as a candidate, well, for succession was pushing him into a corner. There had to be a way to prove his own worth. Since Lucien had just started learning swordsmanship, he would need a sparring partner soon. He ordered his attendant to prepare some sharp real swords. After all, he couldn't be bothered with that wooden trash. He needed real swords. He would show his sickly older brother that nothing had changed. What a little brother thinking he's the main character. Back at the training ground, Lucien was trying to convince the Sword Saint to take on another disciple in his place. Though it might take some time to find the brilliant candidate he had in mind, that person's talent was more than enough to make up for this delay. You promised to bring a worthy disciple to inherit Sir Eiken's legacy even 100 years from now. The old man didn't want to accidentally leave the young master with such a heavy burden. A talented child who thinks of him like this is more than enough. The sword. Saint politely thanked the young master for his kind words and offer. Just as expected, Lucien's proposal must have sounded like nonsense to a seasoned old warrior. Even those hailed as famous swordsmen couldn't catch his eye, so it was only natural for Sir Eisen to doubt Lucien's claim about finding a talent who could rival him. Though the Sword Saint refused, the young master was determined to see it through. If Lucien Vandeck's body was a heavenly creation, acknowledged by the Sword Saint, then surely there had to be someone who could match his potential. In the past, despite a small frame and a lack of proper training, in swordsmanship he knew someone who could slaughter entire battalions of fully equipped knights in the blink of an eye using nothing but pure instinct and talent. He had become the embodiment of a sword that swept across battlefields. His blade had tasted the blood of countless foes, despite a congenital defect. A man Lucien deeply respected, the sword demon Felix. The young master had long aimed to recruit Felix. If honed properly, that man could become his strongest vassal. Bringing him under Sir Eisen's tutelage was a logical decision. Putting the matter of an heir aside, Lucien himself couldn't afford to slack off in his training. The Sword Saint brought out a training dummy and threw him a wooden sword. Before beginning formal swordsmanship lessons, the old man wanted to see Lucien's current skill level. Facing the wooden dummy, he had to perform a vertical slash, a horizontal slash, and a diagonal slash in that exact order. With his experience in Kai training, manipulating mana should be a piece of cake. For the final slash, the sword. Saint wanted to see Lucien unleash a full-power mana-infused finishing blow. Holding a sword for the first time in a new body was a strange experience. He would need to consciously control his strength to some degree. Fortunately, the previous Lucien had learned the sword from a young age. Gripping the wooden sword tightly, he focused on the wooden dummy. His eyes sharpened and every muscle in his body tensed up. Using pure strength and skill, he unleashed a devastating vertical slash. Immediately after that flawless attack, he followed up with a smooth horizontal slash. To complete the trio of angles, a powerful diagonal slash concluded the basic part. Finally, he began preparing for the attack the Sword Saint truly wanted to see. Lucien channeled his pure mana into the sword, making the wooden blade as hard and sharp as tempered steel. His eyes traced the trajectory of the attack with deadly precision. He glared at the wooden dummy as if it owed him money. Swinging the wooden sword upwards from below, he sliced off the dummy's head from a distance. The finishing blow seemed to suck the air out of the training hall as the wooden dummy's severed head clattered to the floor. With just 4 slashes, he had shown the Sword Saint the wild combat instinct within him. He'd had to use all of his focus and strength to make this demonstration a success. Since this was the first time he'd pushed his new body to its limits, he felt less than satisfied with the result. But for a beginner, it wasn't too bad. Lucien wondered if Sir Ison would become stricter now. Unsurprisingly, the old man maintained his deadpan expression. He admitted that the young master had surprised him yet again. If he had to use words to evaluate this performance, he could only describe it as utterly pathetic. The young master thought he was about to be praised to the high heavens, but instead he received a harsh insult. Sir Ison didn't understand why. But Lucien's swordsmanship was full of bad habits, as if he'd never learned the core principles, the very basics of the sword. To put it simply, the way he swung his sword was like a mercenary who only knew how to fight wildly to survive. He focused solely on power and speed. The balance between his body and his mana was out of sync. As a result, the sword's natural sharpness was dulled, revealing countless openings between each movement. Furthermore, he took an embarrassingly long time just to channel mana into the sword for the final strike. By Lucien's own estimation, it had only taken him about 1 or 2 seconds to channel mana into the blade. He needed to realize that an opening of 1 or 2 seconds was more than enough for a worthy opponent to take his life. In the case of the Sword Saint, he would only need a fraction of that time to slice off the young master's head. For this first lesson, Lucien had to start by understanding the importance of every brief second in a battle. That fleeting moment could be the deciding factor between victory and death. He didn't even realize the old man had moved until the tip of his wooden sword touched Lucien's neck. Lucien was forced to face the reality that the difference in their levels was all too real. What a fool he was. He could have died a second time without even realizing it. He had been too engrossed in the sweet life of a noble young master, and it had made him complacent. With absolute sincerity, Lucien swore he would engrave this precious lesson to heart and train relentlessly to correct his bad habits and his mindset. First, Sir Ison wisely reflected that even a gifted body is never omnipotent. One cannot defeat a veteran mana user with pure physical strength alone. Discord between the body and mana leads to a waste of life force. It creates exploitable openings and invites disaster. To draw out the true power of a sword, both internal and external forces must merge into a single flow. True strength is born from that very harmony. To prove his point, the old man unleashed a simple but lightning-fast slash at the wooden dummy. At first, it seemed his attack hadn't left so much as a scratch on its surface. Then suddenly, its entire body shattered into a million tiny pieces, scattering across the training hall. This was the path of the sword the young master had to walk from now on. Several days had passed since their first training session. The master and disciple had moved from practicing with dummies to actual sparring. While Lucien poured all his strength into every attack, Sir Ison used only one hand to parry. Even while holding back, the old man continued to teach him a lesson, combining theory and practice, constantly reminding the young master. The flow of mana must not be interrupted. Physical training helps hone your movements. The goal is to reach a level where you control mana instinctively, just like breathing. While continuously using mana to strengthen your body, you must also reserve enough energy to redirect it elsewhere in an instant. If you can focus intensely at the right place at the right time, Lucien would be unstoppable. Applying everything the old man had taught him over the past few days, the young master boldly attacked from above, but was stopped yet again. Ison kept rambling on about combining elements in perfect harmony and the nature of the sword, all while calmly defeating his student in a lopsided match. A perfect parry sent Lucien flying to the other side of the training grounds. He was about to charge the old man again, but the exhaustion from constantly going all out finally got to him. While he was struggling to catch his breath, the Sword Saint channeled mana into his training sword and challenged his poor student to defend with everything he had. This time, Sir Ison wanted to take their little sparring match to a new level. Lucien had to calculate his enemy's speed and trajectory, then counterattack with precise force. Giving him no time to think, the Sword Saint rushed at him with blinding speed. The young master remained calm and remembered his master's teachings. He had to become one with nature. Like flowing water that way, he could find an opening in his enemy's form. Next, he had to minimize wasted energy to unleash his maximum power. He absolutely could not let the pace of the battle overwhelm him. And he must always look straight ahead. The lessons that were etched into his body and mind finally bore fruit. As he met Sir Ison's ferocious attack, he channeled mana into his wooden sword in record time. At the perfect angle and timing, he deflected the sword aimed at his head. For the first time since he'd begun to learn swordsmanship in earnest, he no longer felt helpless. The perfect mana of a genius and the fluid strength of the sword, Saint, clashed. Sir Ison held the blade lock, sizing up the young master. Deciding he'd seen enough, he gently withdrew his wooden sword, dissipating the force of the impact. He decided to stop there and end the training session. Now Lucian had to engrave the feeling he experienced today deep into his very soul. If he could do that, he would be considered a first-class swordsman. The young master could only give a wry smile. This old man's advice was easier said than done. Forget engraving the feeling into his soul. He couldn't even feel his legs. He collapsed to his knees, completely drained from the intense training. The young master sincerely thanked his master. Around them, the training ground was partially destroyed. Lately, craftsmen were frequently called in to repair the damage, but every time they arrived, the grounds looked even worse. They couldn't even imagine what kind of training the young master was going through to cause this much destruction. Having just finished sparring with the sword, St. Lucian had to collapse and rest for a moment to recover from the grueling pace. He was just grateful to have survived today's session. Who could have guessed that the old man's harsh methods would finally be the thing to break the bad habits he'd built up over a lifetime as a mercenary? If being tormented in the training grounds every day was the way to hone his skills and elevate himself, then he would accept it. This pain only helped him grasp the concepts of swordsmanship more quickly. The more time he spent with Sir Ison, the deeper his admiration for the sword Saint grew. This old man constantly created dangerous situations perfectly tailored to his current level in order to elicit perfect responses coupled with sharp guidance. Lucian knew all too well that what Sir Ison was doing was much easier said than done. He always had a precise grasp of his student's physical condition at all times. Simply entrusting his body to be molded by the man's teachings brought noticeable improvement every single day. Until now, Lucien had always thought the secret to ultimate swordsmanship was just relentless, brutal training to reach a higher plane. He had never considered concepts like balance, latent power, and flow like he was now. The most important element in this whole process had always been within him. If he had known these teachings in his past life, things would have definitely been different in the final battle against that commander. His blade could have gotten so much closer to him. Even now, he still remembered every vivid detail of his death and failure. Replaying that battle in his mind, he absolutely wouldn't go down without a fight. Maybe he could have even surprised the commander with a more complete understanding of swordsmanship. The stain of that crushing defeat was still seared into his mind. Now that he had recovered a bit, Lucien felt it would be a waste to stop training. If only he could find a suitable opponent around here. Perhaps he could measure his progress against them. The gods immediately granted him what he was looking for. His youngest brother, Joshua Van Dek, was arrogantly striding into the training grounds. With a servant trailing behind him, Joshua approached and bowed to Sir Ison. This brat has the nerve to shamelessly call himself a disciple of the Sword Saint. The Sword Saint maintained a pleasant demeanor and asked why the fourth young master had paid him a sudden visit. He politely suggested Joshua return another time as he was busy training the third young master, Lucien. This insolent child's attendant could do nothing to stop his master from barging in and stealing the spotlight. In short, Joshua declared that since his older brother was so determined to train, he was just here to assist, as a younger brother with more sword experience. Judging by the little punk's sarcastic smirk, it was obvious he was just spouting nonsense. Lucien, however, was delighted. A perfect opponent had just delivered himself on a silver platter. Finally, he could vent some of the pain he'd had to endure for the past few days. The sword. Saint could only stand there, rooted to the spot, baffled by the fourth young master's sudden request. After all, how could this kid possibly help with Lucian's training? Joshua wanted to request a sparring match with his older brother to assess their practical skills in channeling mana. His smile looked so innocent. But anyone with half a brain could see the malicious intent behind that smile. He even used the excuse that with their current situation they simply wouldn't have time to bond as brothers if not for a moment like this when they were both free. It would be hard to find another opportunity. Joshua admitted his request might seem a bit rude, but he was just a little brother who wanted to spar with his older brother for a bit. Lucian almost could not help but laugh, hearing how Joshua twisted the story. These young sprouts of the family sure had a silver tongue. How ridiculous it was to hear this brat use brotherly bonding as an excuse. Joshua showed up unannounced, bringing a real sword before an older brother who hadn't even had a week of formal swordsmanship training. The act was so crude and obvious it was almost naive, as his goal was clearly to crush his competitor and solidify his own position. By hiding under the pretext of helping his brother, he believed he could easily get into everyone's good graces. Having the Sword Saint here to observe would add more weight to the sparring match and its outcome. Lucien's reputation was already in tatters, so much so that even a snot-nosed brat was trying to push him down. The young master knew very well where Sir Ison stood in the war for succession. Joshua had just put the old man in an incredibly awkward position. To avoid implicating his respected master any further, Lucien stepped forward and accepted his younger brother's offer. At first he played dumb and praised the youngest brother of the house for having such a kind and admirable heart. Then he cunningly trampled on Joshua's reasoning. He couldn't possibly turn a blind eye to such corrupt behavior. Such meaningless sophistry would never have a place in this house. This matter absolutely could not be so easily overlooked. To personally teach the family's overgrown child a lesson, Lucien was ready to step into the ring. However, today would be the last day he tolerated such childish tantrums. He would never forgive this brat if he dared to put Sir Ison in a difficult position ever again. The Sword Saint could tell that his student had understood the true intentions of Joshua and had decided to put a stop to this nonsense. After all, blood ties are an unbreakable bond. Sir Ison nodded in approval, letting the two brothers settle their differences. However, this would be the last time this happened. If he felt the sparring match became too dangerous, he would intervene to stop it immediately. Both the fourth and third young masters swore to remember the Sword Saint's rules. Lucien gave Joshua a frightening look and wished his youngest brother a wonderful sparring match with a fake smile. The fourth young master responded with blatant hostility. Both fighters stepped onto the platform and faced each other while the Sword Saint stood in the middle as the referee. He reminded the two young men that this battle was not meant to harm each other. It was merely a sparring match to test what they had learned. Lucien was to approach the match with a learning attitude, as this was his first official spar. On the other hand, Joshua had to be responsible as the senior who was familiar with the path of the sword first. The old man demanded they fight without tarnishing the honorable name of the family, Vanek. To signal they were ready, both brothers drew their swords and gripped their hilts tightly. The two young masters stared at each other tensely. Joshua wasn't used to Lucien acting like a proper older brother and standing up for himself. Every time he emphasized that he was older, Joshua took a mental blow. The kid really couldn't stand that a gap of a few months made this guy his older brother. At least he had gotten through the hardest part. He had managed to worm his way in, and he could make Lucien shut up once the sparring match was over. In Joshua's mind, this wasn't about who was born first, but about who truly had the more outstanding talent. By this point, he barely bothered to hide his contempt and malice anymore. He wore expressions one wouldn't even show to a sworn enemy. Focusing all his attention on the steel sword in his hand, Lucien felt an immense familiarity with the cold, heavy sensation it gave him. It had been 2 months and a whole lifetime since he last held a real weapon. If this were back in his mercenary days, he probably would have used all sorts of dirty tricks to win, against a noble brat. But today, he would fight with pride, with the majestic demeanor of the third young master of the Vanek family, if in the of the moment he accidentally used a sword technique from his past life that old man would surely notice. Even though Joshua was a cunning, venomous snake, Lucien still had to remember that this brat was just a child. A naive child who hadn't yet experienced the world. He truly wanted to keep this fight at the moderate level of an older brother. But Joshua made an insolent remark asking where all his earlier confidence had gone. The young master took his cautious glances as a sign of fear. He assumed that with a real sword in hand, the family's disgrace must be sweating bullets from fear. He even pointed out that while major accidents often happen in real sword fights, that only occurs when the skills of both sides are evenly matched. The punk even suggested they could go easy on Lucien by switching to wooden swords, but that it wasn't necessary. He really wanted things to proceed properly. But it seemed Joshua was eager to taste true suffering. For a younger brother who refused to listen, a sound beating was the only effective remedy. Once again, he called the little punk youngest brother, emphasizing every syllable to inflict maximum mental damage. Easily provoked, Joshua lowered his center of gravity. Ready to attack, he sped up and tried to close the distance with quick, heavy steps. His only desire now was to use pure violence to make Lucien regret what he had said. Lucien tightened his stance and anticipated the attack. Just as expected, teaching his younger brother a lesson while having to restrain himself was not easy at all. In any case, Joshua had also received guidance from the Sword Saint, so his fundamentals and movement were on a level that couldn't be taken lightly. Moreover, Lucian was still exhausted, having spent nearly all his mana in the previous fight with Sir Icon. Fortunately, the severe lack of experience of Joshua was impossible to conceal. He fell for such simple taunts so easily. Lucian seized the opportunity and channeled mana into his lower body. He perfectly applied the Sword Saint's teachings on simultaneously focusing power and circulating mana. Only a few meters away from his furious little brother, channeling mana into one leg was more than enough. When he decided to lunge forward, the burst of speed created a sound as piercing as a gunshot. By completely overwhelming Joshua in a contest of speed, Lucian would seize the opening in that split second. Sir Icon's eyes widened with concern. The retainers of Joshua were so stunned their jaws almost hit the floor. Towering over his little brother, Lucian forced Joshua to grit his teeth and defend with all his might. If he couldn't, he might just lose his tongue. Lucian's blade drew a perfect arc with unstoppable force, all while he continued to hurl insults at his younger brother.